Prohibition was dying. And Carlo Gambino had been ready for this moment long before the funeral bell rang. It began in 1919, the same year Congress ratified the Volstead Act, the same year America declared war on liquor. 2 years later, a quiet, sharp-eyed teenager from Palermo stepped off the boat and into the chaos of New York City. Gambino didn't arrive with trumpets or blood on his hands. He wasn't a millionaire, not yet. For the next 10 years, he wouldn't be a king, but a student. He learned the streets like scripture. He learned who to pay, who to watch, and most importantly, when to keep his mouth shut. This was the decade when he turned silence into power and obedience into leverage. He didn't speak unless it counted, and when he did, people listened. By the time Prohibition neared its end, Gambino was already sitting on a quiet fortune, just shy of $500,000, and not a dime of it declared. It wasn't about flash. It was about control, real estate. He owned the property outright. Unlike some of the loud young punks drawn in by the quick money of bootlegging, Gambino built his house to last. Prohibition had killed thousands, some from bullets, others from poison. But it also birthed something else entirely. It wasn't just about liquor anymore. It was about power. It was about the kind of corruption that didn't slither in the dark, but walked proudly down the steps of City Hall. Gangsters and politicians weren't just shaking hands. They were building empires together. Before Prohibition, politicians were greedy. After Prohibition, they were rich. They had found their patrons, not in banks or churches, but in the underworld. Campaigns were funded with blood money, protection rackets, and envelopes passed in the back rooms of smoke-filled restaurants. The people. They were background noise in a power game built on favors and fear. And that was the true curse of American politics. Not that politicians didn't want to help, but that they never had the time. From the minute they were sworn in, they were already planning their re-election. One hand on the Constitution, the other dialing donors. They talked loyalty, but they pledged allegiance to the next campaign check. 3 weeks before Christmas in 1933, the noble experiment finally croaked. 14 years of chaos were over. The country didn't cry. In fact, most celebrated. Prohibition had been a disaster from the start. A moral crusade turned moral collapse. The country had tried to legislate behavior and instead created a new criminal class who were smarter, sharper, and better dressed than the men who arrested them. And while the headlines read like eulogies, the real gangsters, Luciano, Lansky, Costello, Schultz, weren't mourning. They were moving. They had seen it coming. They had already pivoted. Gambling, unions, narcotics, politics. They weren't bootleggers anymore. They were businessmen. American royalty, draped in silk and sin. The bootlegging days were fading into memory, but the men who ran those empires weren't stepping down. They were stepping up. Diversification had been the word whispered in the back rooms of speakeasies for years. Now, it was shouted from private offices and plush casino suites. Gambling was the new gold rush, and the smart ones were already knee-deep in the river. From nickel and dime policy rackets to the seductive glow of slot machines in candy stores, from neighborhood punchboards to grand cathedrals of vice lined with velvet and champagne, gambling was everywhere. And the Italians, while better organized and more disciplined than most, still had to fight for every inch of turf. Dutch Schultz was running wild, and black syndicates controlled vast sections of the city, territories that even the police refused to enter. These weren't just neighborhoods. They were fortresses. The waterfront, Harlem, and entire city blocks ran under codes of silence, enforced not by law, but by blood. If you wanted control, you didn't file paperwork. You walked in, you figured out who ran the joint, and then you made them an offer. A deal, a threat, a promise. You found the man with the keys and put him on the payroll. Frank Costello knew the game better than anyone. Joe Adonis wasn't far behind. But the future? The future was still quiet, still calculating. It wore a faint smile and spoke in whispers. The future was named Gambino. And in Harlem, another name was rising too, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He was smart, respected, and brutal when he needed to be. He played chess while others were still learning checkers. He cut deals with the Italians not out of fear, but because he knew what they brought: structure, reach, and real money. In cities where law and order could be bought wholesale, organized crime built fortresses of glamour. New Orleans had its Beverly Club, a glittering palace of sin run by Phil Castile. And upstairs, behind the curtain, was the Blue Room at the Roosevelt Hotel, where Seymour Weiss watched the tables and shook hands with governors. It was Weiss, incidentally, who was the last man to see Huey Long alive. A few hours later, Long was dead, bullet in the belly. One of the first great American casinos had been born not in Las Vegas, not in New York, but in New Orleans. And behind the velvet rope stood the New Orleans Mafia. But they weren't alone. The heads of that casino ran straight to New York. Frank Costello was already neck-deep in it, and the man representing the Bayou side of the operation was Carlos Marcello. Small in size, volcanic in temperament. He was becoming Costello's shadow in the South, whispering about narcotics, making plays, and keeping a watchful eye on his growing influence. Across the country, the empire sprawled like ivy. In Kentucky's Covington and Newport, the lights never dimmed. Hot Springs, Arkansas, wasn't just a backwoods resort town. To the underworld, it was a fortress in the hills' southern sanctuary, wrapped in steam, sulfur, and silence. And the man who turned it into a gangster's paradise was Oni Madden. An old-school bootlegger with a British accent and a trigger finger, Madden carved out a kingdom next to the Louisiana state line and dared anyone to challenge it. Even Lucky Luciano, the boss of bosses, found refuge there. When New York prosecutor Thomas Dewey came charging after Luciano with indictments and headlines, Luciano didn't run to Cuba or Florida or Sicily. He ran to Arkansas, to Hot Springs, because Madden had that town locked tighter than a vault. Cops, judges, politicians, they all answered him. For a few days, Lucky felt untouchable again. But time doesn't play favorites. The old Prohibition giants were fading, some into retirement, others into coffins, and waiting in the wings was a new kind of powerhouse. Younger, sharper, Southern-bred and Sicilian-rooted, Carlos Marcello. As the decades turned, Marcello began sinking his hooks deep into the bones of Arkansas. What Madden had once built, Marcello would absorb. Not with fanfare, but with money. Specifically, drug money. Marcello understood what heroin could buy. Not just territory, but loyalty. He used narcotics to bankroll elections, to build candidates from the ground up like made men. In some cases, the politicians weren't just bought, they were partners. They sat at the table. They counted the votes and the stacks. Marcello didn't shout about control. He made it look like democracy. And just down the coastline, in the sunlit chaos of Dade and Broward County, Florida, the dice were still rolling. Casinos hummed. The air was thick with rum and cigarettes, and every spin of the roulette wheel sounded like a declaration. The syndicate was still here, still growing. This wasn't just criminal activity. It was criminal architecture. From Arkansas to Miami, from Harlem to Havana, they weren't just making money. They were building an empire. On the Hudson, Ben Marden's Riviera stood like a monument to the old days. Music, money, and murder, tucked beneath tuxedos. And then came the South Jersey coast. An agreement was struck with Nucky Johnson, the political warlord of Atlantic City. Johnson was cut in for 25%. The rest, all profit. The organization supplied the capital, the machines, the dealers, and the protection. Johnson supplied silence. It was the beginning of something vast, something unspoken, an empire still wrapped in shadows. Luciano and his closest lieutenants had already conquered New York, but by the spring of 1933, their vision had grown bigger than boroughs. There was talk of new territories, of untouched gold sitting just outside America's borders. At the Waldorf Towers, in a suite that overlooked the city, Luciano summoned a meeting of the Union Siciliano. The topic wasn't bootlegging or bookmaking. It was something Meyer Lansky had been whispering about for months. Just 90 miles off the coast of Florida, he said, there was a place where the sun never set on opportunity: Havana. Tourism was rising. The beaches were clean, the officials could be bought, and the politics were flexible. It was a gangster's dream. Meyer and I been working on this since that Roosevelt double cross, Luciano told the men seated in tailored suits and quiet power. We got to move our dough somewhere it'll keep making money. We got to get Washington off our backs. Meyer's already been down to Havana. He's made some good contacts. He's going back by August or September. He'll probably close the deal. But it ain't going to be cheap. Everybody needs to be ready to put in $500,000. $500,000 in 1933 wasn't a buy-in. It was a declaration of war. Chuck Polizzi from Cleveland flipped out, shouting about the cost, until Luciano leaned in and reminded him just how much cash they were bleeding out of Covington, Kentucky. There was no more room for doubt. Everyone paid. By September, Lansky was in Havana. He sat with Batista, a familiar face from the Prohibition days, now the strongman of Cuba, and he came back with gambling rights for the entire island. The casino at the Hotel Nacional was just the beginning. One of the men sitting at that table was Tommy Lucchese, a quiet tactician with close ties to Gambino. They trusted each other, moved in silence, and understood the weight of what came next. Lucchese wasn't just there for the politics. He was there to offer up his end of the money. And he wasn't above using street logic to do it. A little bump here, a little skimming there. He didn't just invest his own money. He took what he needed, wherever he could find it. Gambino, by that point, was earning well. He wasn't flashy, but the cash flowed steadily. And with Lucchese at his side, a man he trusted like family, Gambino knew exactly where to place his bets. A large portion of Lucchese's initial $500,000 stake came through Gambino. Not directly, of course. That wasn't his style. He moved quietly, filtered his piece through Lucchese, and in doing so became a silent partner in Havana. It was a smart move. Gambino understood Lansky's molasses racket inside out. He didn't need to control it. He just needed to control the ports, the protection, the channels that made it profitable. In New York and beyond, Gambino positioned himself as the critical link in Lansky's supply chain. And with every barrel moved and every bottle labeled. The money rolled in. For the deal to happen in Havana, Meyer Lansky needed $3 million in cold cash had changed hands. The deposit was wired through Zurich, clean and quiet. Batista would get that much every year, minimum, with more skimmed off the top depending on the percentages. Back in Europe, the Corsican Mafia had been ruling the dark corners of the Mediterranean trade routes since before Mussolini knew how to fire a pistol. Their reputation was blood and iron, narcotics. The muscle, but not the brains. They didn't understand American vice, but they'd become useful later, for muscle, for silence. Human trafficking, and the worst of it, white slavery. Orphans from the wreckage of the First and Second World Wars were sold and shuffled like contraband. This was their first beachhead in the Caribbean. But it wouldn't be the last. Soon, Nassau, Santo Domingo, and quiet investments throughout the Gulf. The islands needed the Americans more than the Americans needed the islands. The legal casinos couldn't run a craps table if their lives depended on it. The Corsicans. They had. By the late 1940s, Their operations would merge with something bigger, darker, and far more organized. That merger would be with the Central Intelligence Agency. Long before covert operations became official doctrine, the American underworld was already building the blueprint, banking in Switzerland, laundering through neutral ports, and buying elections in countries that couldn't pronounce their own presidents' names. Havana, the Dominican Republic, Marseille, all became staging grounds. And behind the curtain, envelopes moved from one sweaty palm to another. By the 1950s, the CIA would follow the same roads the mob had already paved. Operation Gladio would tie Corsican traffickers to French intelligence, who then answered to American handlers. From the political offices of Marseille to the docks of Le Havre, anyone who threatened the American-backed order could vanish overnight. In Cuba, Batista's Gestapo-style police would soon be doing the same, executing rivals, choking dissent, and clearing the field for more American money to flow in. The Hotel Nacional glittered, but in the alleys behind it, bodies dropped without sound. By 1958, as whispers of revolution spread through Havana, the mob already had a lifeboat ready in the Dominican Republic. The groundwork had been laid back in the 1930s. Small bribes, strategic deposits, and quiet men in loud offices. New banking hubs rose as the British Empire crumbled, and crime families didn't miss a beat. They didn't need legitimacy to play like kings. They needed access. By the time naval intelligence and the CIA needed politicians abroad, the mob already had them in their pockets. These weren't just racketeers anymore, they were architects of control. They didn't just corrupt systems, they created them. Gambling was only one leg of the new syndicate economy. The real expansion, the real power play, was diversification. Not just into vice, but into the very arteries of the American economy. Loan sharking was the lever. In a country buckled by the Depression, ready cash was oxygen, and when borrowers defaulted, they didn't just lose assets, they picked up new business partners. The garment district, once a hive of legitimate enterprise, was soon swarming with outfits quietly owned or controlled by men who never appeared on the paperwork. Then came trucking. What had started as a logistical necessity during Prohibition, moving liquor fast, clean, and under the radar, turned into a masterclass in logistics. By the early 1930s, the mob had arguably the largest trucking network in the country. They knew routes, schedules, fuel consumption, deadlines, better than most legitimate haulers. So, when the time came to pivot, they did it with precision. Bread, milk, produce, any product with a ticking expiration date was the target. They didn't need to buy companies outright. A little pressure, a little experience, and soon they were pulling fractions of a cent off every loaf of bread sold across major cities. That added up to millions. They bought dairies, controlled meat distribution. Lepke and Schultz were taxing both ends of the supply chain, leaning on the meat packers, then collecting from the restaurants to ensure smooth deliveries. Even high-profile joints like Jack Dempsey's restaurant on Broadway paid out. On the waterfront, Sox Lanza made sure nothing flopped without his say-so. Fulton Fish Market was the largest seafood hub in the world, owned by the city, but run by the mob. And nobody, not even Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, the little flower himself, dared interfere. This industrial takeover wasn't happening in a vacuum. The rise of the American automobile had lit a fire under the entire economy. Veterans returning from the First World War weren't interested in horses and carts. They wanted engines. And with Henry Ford pushing mass production in Detroit, the American transportation revolution had already begun. By the end of the Second World War, it was a tidal wave. And wherever something moved, organized crime followed. It wasn't just trucks and cargo anymore. It was garbage collection, construction, fish, food, cement. They embedded themselves into every contract and route in the city. Infrastructure was up for grabs, and they had the muscle, the money, and the manpower to take it. Even men like Henry Ford, battling organized labor in Detroit, leaned on local crime figures to neutralize union resistance. Trucks weren't just vehicles, they were currency, dominance, reach. Some sectors welcomed this quiet invasion. Others didn't, not even within the mob. Real estate, for instance, sparked resistance from the old-school racketeers. It wasn't glamorous. There were no corners to shake down, no sudden score. It was steady, clean. A good building might not pay off like a rigged slot machine, but it brought in rent, week after week, month after month. Still, when Lansky and Luciano floated the idea of buying into property, a few hardliners laughed. They couldn't see past the next score. "What the hell are we going to do with a building?" someone asked. "You can't shake it down." And so they missed deals that would later be worth hundreds of millions, missed the evolution. The brains in the Unioni could only think in terms of short cons and spaghetti dinners. Meanwhile, the last gasp of Prohibition was becoming a final payday. The law was dying in full view. Luciano and his crew had long since stopped pretending. Their liquor was flowing wide open. They had warehouses stockpiled down by Atlantic City, across Ohio, in storage facilities hidden in plain sight. The minute Prohibition ended, the booze became legitimate, and they gave it away. Churches and synagogues received entire shipments. In New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, religious institutions held rummage sales with scotch and gin as the main attractions. They kept the profits. Liquid bingo, one man called it. Dutch Schultz, eyeing a conversion to Catholicism, dumped his whole inventory into churches across New York and New Jersey. It brought him credibility. He made friends with priests. It gave him a kind of immunity in the neighborhoods where reputation meant more than any badge. But the real play was in staying in the liquor business without looking like gangsters. The speakeasies became nightclubs. The same men who ran illegal distilleries now backed licensed distributors. They couldn't own American liquor companies outright. Too dirty, too notorious. But they had friends abroad. Old connections with foreign distillers were activated. Franchises were acquired. Distribution rights were cut and sealed. Costello and Castell formed alliance distributors, locking down exclusive rights to import King's Ransom and House of Lords Scotch from the Whiteley Company in Scotland. Then they bought into the company's British holding firm, J.G. Turney and Sons Limited. Lansky, Luciano, Siegel, Adonis, they all took a slice of Capital Wine and Spirits, importing the finest French wines, Scotch, Canadian blends, and even domestic labels. It wasn't just liquor. It was legitimacy. And every major bootlegger who had made a name during Prohibition found a way to cut themselves into this new reality. Lansky never believed Prohibition was truly over. The law may have changed, but the profits hadn't. Taxed liquor was expensive, bloated with federal fees and paperwork. Bootleg booze, untaxed, unregulated, still flowed through backrooms and back alleys for a fraction of the cost. It was a simple equation, and Lansky understood it better than anyone. That's when he made his move. He broke from the Bug and Meyer gang, splintering from his lifelong partnership with Benjamin Siegel. Polanski remained loyal to Lansky, said he'd follow him anywhere. But Benny had a family now, daughters, responsibilities, and his own way of seeing the future. He wasn't just a killer or a charmer anymore. He had vision. He had style. He could move through a ballroom with the same ease he once moved through a pool hall. He had gone to Italy at a time when Mussolini ruled with an iron fist, brushing shoulders with fascists, even brushing close with Nazi officials. And yet, he walked away. That was Siegel. He didn't fear men, he didn't follow them, and he no longer had any interest in staying in Meyer Lansky's shadow. From childhood, he'd been the one with blood on his hands while Lansky played the long game. Now he was building something of his own. Las Vegas wasn't a dream, it was an answer. Siegel saw the corruption in New Orleans and decided it wouldn't last. He didn't want a slice of a rotten pie. He wanted to bake something new in the desert. While Siegel chased neon lights, Lansky began to pivot in silence. In November 1933, using his father-in-law, Moses Citron, as a front, he created the Malaska Corporation. The charter called it a sugar substitute company, dehydrated molasses, but the truth sat underneath. Malaska was a base operation for industrial-scale alcohol production. Stills in Ohio and New Jersey began pumping out product, feeding bootleggers, supplying legitimate distilleries, and selling backdoor whiskey under clean labels. It didn't go unnoticed. Luciano called him in close to Christmas. He didn't scold, didn't threaten, just laid it out straight. Malaska could stay Lansky's, no strings. But the legal whiskey business, the clubs, the brands, the entire infrastructure, that was going to be Luciano's operation, and he wanted Lansky to draw the blueprint. Personnel, costs, distribution points. The whole play. Lansky did it. The Malaska operation would eventually collapse under federal heat, but the break was clear. Lansky had begun carving his own lane, and even Luciano, years later, admitted it. Meyer was different. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't want the photos, the courtrooms, the ink. That was his genius. While others posed for the newspapers, Lansky was ghosting through shadows and building systems. Luciano had charisma. Lansky had permanence. In the aftermath of Prohibition, Meyer Lansky understood one brutal truth. The liquor game wasn't over. It was just getting smarter. He needed someone who could move molasses and bootlegged liquor with the same cold efficiency they'd shown during the dry years. That man was Carlo Gambino. Quiet, calculating, and already buying up distilleries the moment the legal dust settled, Gambino didn't just slip into the untaxed liquor trade. He made it his personal goldmine. With his knack for fraud, Gambino started slapping fake labels on the same bottles they used during Prohibition. Moving product like the Volstead Act never ended. It was seamless, profitable. And Lansky noticed. He saw something rare in Gambino, a strategist with vision, a man who had the instincts of a boss but none of the headlines. Aside from a minor case he beat without breaking a sweat, Gambino's name never made the papers. That was exactly what made him dangerous. Lansky knew he was watching the future. He may not have made his millions during Prohibition, but he was going to make damn sure he caught up now. And Gambino was the key. That partnership, forged in the shadows just as Prohibition ended, marked the beginning of something larger. Lansky, ever the realist, understood the Jewish era in organized crime was fading. The Italians were consolidating power, and the ones who'd survive, Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Frank Scalise, were the quiet ones, the ones who didn't need the spotlight. And then came Jimmy Blue Eyes, an Italian by name, a Lansky loyalist by blood. He wasn't just muscle. He was a lifeline, a best friend, a guardian angel in a world where trust was measured in silence and survival. Through the 1930s, the alliance between Luciano, Frank Scalise, Jimmy Blue Eyes, Joe Adonis, Anastasia, Gambino and Lansky held its shape. But something shifted in Lansky. His son had been born disabled, and the world was changing. The rise of fascism, the growing threat of war, and the endless headlines about mobsters falling. He started reading books about empires, about Caesar, Napoleon, men who rose fast and fell hard. He knew the pattern. Dutch Schultz was already slipping. Genovese was making his plays. Even Lucky wasn't immune. Lansky wanted out of America, not in exile, but in expansion. He wanted escape routes, new foundations. He knew power in the US was finite. In Miami, his people weren't even allowed in certain hotels. In parts of Florida, Jews were still barred from buying property. It was a cold place. Havana, by contrast, felt safe, like possibility. He had been quietly reinforcing that island ever since Batista opened the doors. As Washington leaned harder into corruption probes, Lansky started networking with the ones who didn't wear flashy rings or shoot their mouths off. Old world bosses. Quiet men who'd survived everything. Russell Bufalino, Stefano Magaddino, Tommy Lucchese, Frank Scalich, Carlo Gambino, Jimmy Blue Eyes. Names that didn't shout, but whispered with authority. He surrounded himself with layers, Jewish fixers, Sicilian bosses, political bagmen, and diplomats who owed him favors. Chicago couldn't touch him. New York wouldn't dare. New Orleans knew better. It wasn't just respect. It was fear wrapped in inevitability. He kept watching the headlines, watched the Nuremberg trials unfold on the television, watching the world pretend it hadn't known what was happening. The Holocaust wasn't just a historical moment for Lansky. It was a warning, a reminder. He had been building his empire with shadows for years, but now he began to realize just how fragile safety really was. And in the shadows, he built alliances with Mike Miranda, Carlo Gambino, Jimmy Blue Eyes. Into the 1940s, that circle would tighten. In the 1950s, it would stretch from Florida to Italy, and at its height, he would preside over Havana like a monarch, until the day Fidel Castro swept it all away. Vito Genovese was relentless. While the organization expanded into booze, gambling, and labor, Genovese kept circling back to one obsession: narcotics. He never let it go. He pushed it constantly, at dinners, in meetings, whispering into Luciano's ear like a devil with a fixation. Even Luciano joked bitterly that maybe Vito's mother had been Neapolitan, but his father had to be an English bulldog, because he never let go of anything. In 1932, Genovese fell hard for Anna Petillo Venetico. The only problem was she was already married. That didn't matter. He had Gerard Venetico garroted and tossed off a rooftop like trash. A few weeks later, he married the widow and swept her off to Italy for a honeymoon tour of Naples. He wanted to show her what kind of man he was on home turf, an American big shot in the old country, throwing money around, shaking hands with officials, flashing jewelry and power. What Genovese was really doing was laying roots. Connections with fascist figures. Side deals with chemists and traffickers. Despite warnings not to involve himself with narcotics contacts in Italy or France, he ignored it all. He was already envisioning something larger. While others saw a temporary escape or a nostalgic trip, Vito saw a staging ground. Back in New York, Joe Bonanno and Steve Magaddino paid Luciano a visit. They didn't like what they were hearing. Genovese, they said, was already planning a pipeline, a narcotics line direct from Italy into the US. Magaddino even told Vito, flat out, he'd call the Unione Council and have him eliminated if he didn't back off. But talking to Vito was like talking to granite. He smiled, nodded. Then I kept moving. Luciano didn't realize just how far Vito had gone until it was too late. Anna eventually turned on him. The marriage unraveled in the 1950s, bitter and public. She accused him of being a racketeer, a violent husband, a drug kingpin. Her statements opened the floodgates. Investigators came knocking. Associates were named. Contacts scrutinized. Nobody was safe. The collapse gave room to others. While Genovese obsessed over Costello, over Anna, over his rise to the top, Gambino remained almost invisible. He wasn't creating noise. He was creating opportunity. While Vito was brawling in courtrooms and fighting the headlines, Gambino was quietly realigning himself with Luciano. He wasn't making speeches. He wasn't throwing elbows. But he was watching every misstep Genovese made. In Italy, Genovese had continued building his operation, despite the chaos. Narcotics were still his preferred tool: bribes, funding, control. He used drug money to sway officials, feed hunger, and keep mouths shut. As the Second World War approached, those alliances only deepened. With fascism rising, the world was tilting. And when American troops finally invaded Italy, Genovese was already positioned. His connections with the underworld, the black market, and local mayors helped him link up with naval intelligence. He played fixer, translator, and advisor. Operation Gladio hadn't been born yet, but the roots were being watered. In New York, Gambino was already part of the quiet structure forming underneath Genovese's vision. In Havana, Santo Trafficante began to establish his own narcotics routes, slipping into alignment. In New Orleans, Carlos Marcello was doing the same. Genovese didn't wait for the old guard's approval. He started courting the men who would matter in the next 10 years. He saw Trafficante, Gambino, and Marcello not as rivals, but as the future. And whatever else could be said about Vito, he knew how to build. But greed uncoiled everything. Shortly after returning from Italy, Genovese crossed paths with Ferdinand, the shadow Boccia, a mid-level hustler with a plan. Boccia had found a mark, a Brooklyn merchant who loved to gamble and didn't know when to quit. The pitch was simple: run a poker game, fleece the sucker, and split the winnings. Genovese agreed. Together with Mike Miranda, they cleaned the merchant out for $50,000. Then they sold him a fake machine that supposedly printed real $10 bills for another 100 grand. And then Vito refused to pay Boccia his promised cut. Instead, he sent Willie Gallo and Ernest the Hawk Rupolo to silence him. Boccia was gunned down. But Vito wasn't finished. He ordered Rupolo to kill Gallo too. The hit failed, twice. All Rupolo managed was a minor wound. Gallo went to the police, then to the stand. The Hawk went down for 9 to 20 years, and Genovese started walking like a man with a noose tightening around his neck. For years afterward, he kept his head down, watching for signs, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Rupolo was inside, and prison could turn men into birds, the kind that sang. But Genovese's real problem wasn't the Hawk. It was what was coming with repeal. With the end of Prohibition came reform. Public support shifted. The same nation that had once celebrated gangsters wanted them gone. New York politics hardened. Federal attention sharpened. The rackets weren't just under pressure, they were under siege. For over a year, Dutch Schultz was buried in legal trouble. His focus, his money, his muscle, all of it was tied up in the courtroom. The last thing he wanted was to face a jury in New York, where the political winds had turned ice cold against mob bosses. His lawyers maneuvered hard and won a change of venue. By April 1935, the trial was moved to Syracuse, far from the heat of Manhattan. The federal case against him had been built years earlier by Thomas Dewey and his team, though Dewey himself had left the prosecutor's office in 1933 to return to private practice. Now, it was up to John McKeevers, a special assistant to the Attorney General, to carry it forward. The defense barely broke a sweat. They didn't dispute that Schultz had pulled in more money than anyone wanted to admit, but they argued that since his profits came from illegal bootlegging, an industry already dead and buried, he'd been told by counsel that he didn't need to report it. When he found out he was wrong, he offered to settle the tab, $100,000. The jury deliberated for 2 days before announcing they were deadlocked. 7 wanted to convict. 5 held out. The government came back swinging, securing a second trial, this time in Malone near the Canadian border. Schultz arrived early and made himself a fixture in the community. He bought drinks in every tavern, threw money at charities, made appearances with local officials, even posed with the mayor. He played the role of the grateful benefactor in a town starving for relief. By the time the clergy raised the alarm, he'd already dug in. They pulled his bail, but not before he left behind a trail of favors, donations, and quiet payoffs. When the trial began, it was déjà vu. The same charges, the same defense, the same argument. He'd pay the 100,000, guilty or not. The jury returned in 2 days with a not guilty verdict. Their foreman, Leon Chapin, a dairy executive, said flatly that the government had failed to prove Schultz had made a taxable dollar. Judge Frederick Bryant was livid. He stared down the jurors and told them they had undermined law enforcement, emboldened criminals, and embarrassed the bench. Attorney General Homer Cummings called the verdict a miscarriage of justice. Back in New York, Schultz's associates were stunned. They had already begun slicing up his empire, planning as if Dutch would be away for a decade. Now he was walking back into the fold. Luciano wasn't surprised. "We were all sure that Dutch had to get it," he said. "But when Dixie Davis came to me, asking about moving the trial, I told him Dutch was the biggest miser in town. He had to spread some loot, and he did. Bought his way out." The man most rattled was Bo Weinberg, Schultz's top lieutenant, the one who knew everything. Bo had watched Schultz siphon cash from their operations to fight the case, and started to think the whole empire might go down with him. He approached Longy Zwilman in New Jersey. They shared mutual interests, but Weinberg needed a lifeline. His world, Schultz's world, was crumbling. Dutch was on the edge, paranoid and reckless, and Weinberg saw what was coming. So he went to Abner Zwilman, who brought him straight to Luciano. The meeting was discreet, just outside Grant's tomb. No bodyguards, no noise. Weinberg laid out the offer. Schultz's entire operation, policy, numbers, protection, would go to Luciano and his allies. In return, Weinberg would stay on as manager, quietly taking 15%. He wasn't negotiating, he was pleading, sweating through his collar, trying to salvage something before a war of succession ripped everything apart. Luciano took the proposal seriously. He called a meeting at the Waldorf Towers, his war room. Around the table, Zwilman, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Lepke Buchalter, Tommy Lucchese, and Vito Genovese. Carlo Gambino was close, still in Mangano's, Scalise's, Adonis's, as well as Lucchese's shadow, but watching everything. Luciano laid it out. The Schultz empire was ripe for the taking, but it had to be divided cleanly. Gambling went to Costello and Lansky. Liquor to Adonis, who used Gambino to handle the transportation through Gambino's and Adonis's trucking network. The restaurant rackets and muscle, extortion, collections, would be handled by Lepke and Lucchese. After the death of Lepke, it fell into the hands of Lucchese and Carlo Gambino. Gambino was in the room, not yet at the table, but this was a pivotal moment. Lepke was already treading water. Too much heat. Too many enemies. Everyone knew it. It was just a matter of time before someone pushed him under. And when that happened, Gambino would be ready. Zwilman, ever the diplomat, kept control of New Jersey. He agreed to split it with Willie Moretti, keeping peace in the region. But that arrangement wouldn't last. What people often overlook is that Zwilman was more than a bootlegger. He was key to the national loan sharking racket. By 1959, he was under pressure, tax troubles, federal heat. And some say he tried leaning on Gambino for help. That was a mistake. Soon after, Longy Zwilman was found dead, hanging from a shower rod. Officially, suicide. But the streets knew better. With Moretti already gone, whacked in 1951, Zwilman's death opened the door for Gambino and Genovese to carve up the Jersey rackets. Genovese, as always, kept quiet, eyes forward, waiting. Luciano looked at him. "What part do you think you ought to have?" he asked. Vito didn't flinch, said nothing. Luciano pushed again. "Maybe you'd like it all?" Silence. The room froze. That silence said everything. Luciano broke the tension himself, handing Genovese 25%. No more. The rest went to Frank and Meyer, and as always, Luciano took his piece off the top. The arrangement came with a caveat. If by some miracle Dutch Schultz beat the case, everything would go back to him. No blood spilled, no headlines, just business. But what Luciano and his circle didn't understand was that organized crime moved in cycles, swings and roundabouts. A man crushed by indictments today could be king by next year. A boss at the top could fall overnight from a subpoena, a bullet, or a deportation order. They laughed at Vito, disrespected him in subtle jabs and closed-door decisions. But Gambino wasn't laughing. He saw the resentment growing, heard it whispered from Joe Adonis, in Frank Scalise's nervous voice. From the Mangano brothers and even Albert Anastasia, none of them liked Vito. The betrayal seeds were already in the soil. Just as Maranzano never saw Luciano coming, Luciano was beginning to miss the warning signs too. Then Dutch came home. He knew something was off within the hour. He called Luciano, who told him the businesses were preserved, the books clean, the men loyal. When he visited the towers, Vito was there. Schultz, grateful, started talking religion. Said he'd been studying Catholicism, wanted to convert, thought Christ had helped him beat the rap. Luciano couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Dutchman, once feared on the streets, now wanted to know how to go to confession. But despite his talk of faith, Schultz didn't stop watching. He saw what had changed in his absence. His time in Jersey had been managed by Zwilman, but now he felt threatened. He suspected betrayal, and he believed it started with Bo Weinberg. Schultz set a trap. He had Zwilman's home staked out. It paid off. One warm night in September, Weinberg's car was seen pulling into Zwilman's driveway. Dutch got the call and showed up fast. When Bo left the house, Schultz was waiting for him. Weinberg was never seen again. One of the men on the stakeout claimed he saw Schultz kill him with his bare hands. Quiet, deliberate, cold. Luciano got the word and understood the message. Schultz had returned not with gratitude, but with blood in his eye. By 1934, Carlo Gambino was starting to feel like his crew was turning into something more than just a tight operation. It was becoming a small empire, sophisticated, disciplined, profitable. But not everyone in his orbit shared the same restraint. There were days when recklessness snuck in, disguised as ambition. And in Gambino's case, that recklessness came with a familiar last name. Paul Castellano, a young and brash relative of Gambino's, had made a rookie mistake. The kind of loud, messy move that Carlo had spent his entire life avoiding. It was July 3rd, 1934, and Paul Castellano, barely out of his teens, was arrested in Brooklyn as a fugitive from justice. Connecticut authorities had been hunting him after a tailor shop held up in Hartford. The job was sloppy, fast, and stupid. The kind of thing that either gets you a quick score or a long sentence. That night, two men had walked into a small shop on Zion Street. They talked friendly in Italian, asked for water. Then one of them, later identifies as Castellano, pulled a black revolver from inside his coat and jammed it into the tailor's ribs. They took $51, shoved the tailor into a closet, and walked out like it was just another night in the city. But what Paul didn't count on was a sharp-eyed neighbor who had been watching the entire time from a porch nearby. That man spotted the New York plates on the getaway car and jotted down the number. Within hours, the teletype buzzed in Brooklyn. The car belonged to Paul Castellano. Cops found it in his garage, still warm. In the glove box, a Colt revolver. Paul was found in bed, pretending like he hadn't gone anywhere. He was arrested on a gun charge under the Sullivan Act, but things only got worse. Detective D'Onofrio from Hartford arrived the next day with the victim, Nicholas Leone, who had no trouble picking Paul out of a lineup. Paul, trying to save himself, admitted to being involved, but claimed he was just the driver, a guy who picked up two strangers in Bridgeport. According to him, He had no idea who they were or what they were planning. When the job was done, he said they left him behind. But cops weren't buying it. The court hit him with a $15,000 bond as a fugitive and prepared him for extradition. Whether Paul Castellano had already taken the oath of La Cosa Nostra at this point is unclear. But one thing was certain: he understood the rules, the real rules. When pressed to give up his partners after a botched robbery, Castellano spun a tale so absurd it almost passed for comedy. Hitchhikers, he said, strangers, just a few random guys he picked up who suddenly decided to knock over a store with him. No names, no confessions. Just silence and a story with holes big enough to drive a truck through. He took the fall alone. It earned him a year in Hartford County Jail. But in truth, he barely served 3 months. By the time he was released on December 24th, just in time for Christmas, Paul Castellano walked back into Bensonhurst not as a screw-up, but as something else entirely. A kid who'd kept his mouth shut. A kid who had done time like a man. The Sullivan Act charge was eventually dropped. He returned to Connecticut to answer for the robbery, posted bond, and stood trial on a single count of robbery with violence. He pleaded guilty. No theatrics, no trial. He faced it head on. To the outside world, it was just another small-time collar. But inside the circles that mattered, it was a statement. Still, for Carlo Gambino, it was a headache. Not because Paul had committed a robbery. Those were a dime a dozen. It was the way it happened. Sloppy, loud, embarrassing. Castellano had broken the one rule Gambino lived by: stay invisible. The arrest made noise, it made headlines, and more importantly, it made people look. Tommy Lucchese caught wind of it. Frank Scalise heard. Even Luciano, the Mangano brothers, Anastasia's crew, they all clocked it. Dutch Schultz was still circling, and now another name had been added to the radar. Castellano's misstep didn't just pull attention. It cracked the surface of something Gambino had worked years to seal. Gambino didn't yell. He didn't exile Paul. That wasn't his way. Blood was blood. But it meant Paul couldn't be left to his own devices. He had to be watched, reshaped, polished. Pulled out of the street game and handed a blueprint. Not everyone got that chance. Paul did. His schooling would start in silence, behind the scenes, under close watch. Because in the world Gambino was shaping, one of precision, of patience, there was no room for freelancers, and no margin for repeat mistakes. At that moment in time, Paul Castellano was nobody. Just a name in the background, a kid with connections but no weight behind them. His missteps, though serious, barely made a ripple in the underworld. The real story, what everyone was watching, was the war brewing in Washington. The political rot in America had spread so deep that no one in the Democratic Party walked clean. Every senator, every political kingmaker had dirt under their fingernails. Prohibition had created a country where crime wasn't just tolerated. It was embedded. Embedded in ballots, in city contracts, in federal boards. There was a hole in it all, though. A vacuum, the kind that invited ambition. Franklin D. Roosevelt knew how to read a room. His political instincts were sharper than most. He didn't push policies. He let the people push him. When public pressure built, he moved with it, signing laws, launching actions, making the chaos look like strategy. He didn't need to go after the mob. But when the heat rose and no Democrat had the stomach to take on their own benefactors, it left an opening. The job fell to someone outside the circle, someone with ambition, a sharp jaw, and a reputation for discipline. Tom Dewey. The public knew him as a prosecutor, a Republican, a man who hated communists and loved clean government, but few understood how far Dewey's influence would stretch. He would become one of the quiet architects of what would later be called the Central Intelligence Agency. His assignment now was simpler: take down lucky Luciano. There was only one problem. Luciano, for all his influence, wasn't the biggest name on the street just yet. Dutch Schultz still held that title. It was dumb luck that Dutch never got the chance to come for them first, because Dewey came for Dutch. The blood in Dewey's eyes wasn't political, it was personal. In early 1935, Dewey was appointed special prosecutor for New York City, brought in after the system failed itself. Fiorello LaGuardia had won City Hall, but the district attorney's office remained a Tammany Hall stronghold. Their man, William Copeland Dodge, barely squeaked into office with the help of dirty money and underworld pressure. Dodge was window dressing. When pressed to act against corruption, he formed a grand jury, then refused to act on the evidence it uncovered. The grand jury revolted. They demanded a special prosecutor with teeth. Governor Herbert Lehman, caught between pressure and political debt, handed the job to Tom Dewey. Dewey moved quickly. Schultz was the first target. The rumors came fast. Dewey had enough on Schultz to lock him away for restaurant rackets, and possibly even a murder rap for Jules Modgilowski. The story went that Dutch had gunned down Modgilowski in a hotel room in Albany, with his lawyer Dixie Davis in the room. That story would surface later when Davis, under indictment himself, began spilling what he knew. Luciano wasn't convinced Dewey could deliver. Not with Schultz. Dutch beat the feds once, he said. An airtight case in Dewey's office didn't mean it was going to be airtight in court. But it wasn't the courtroom that scared them. It was what Dutch might do if he thought he was going down. He had enough on everyone. Luciano, Lansky, Costello, the whole council. If he wanted to deal his freedom for someone else's downfall, he could do it. And even if he didn't talk, if he walked free again, he'd want everything back. And that meant war. Meetings piled up. More meetings than business. No one wanted to be caught flat-footed. The conversation kept circling back to Dutch. Then it all shifted. Albert Anastasia came straight to Luciano. No games, no filters. Dutch Schultz had approached him, he said. Asked him to quietly stake out Tom Dewey's apartment. Just surveillance at first. See how easy it might be to take the prosecutor out. Dutch was offering him the contract. Anastasia didn't mince words. He didn't deal in whispers. Luciano exploded. That crossed a line. "We never killed nobody but our own," he snapped. "And never without a vote." Killing a cop or a politician wasn't just risky. It was suicide. A hit like that in Manhattan or Albany. That would bring down the federal government like a wrecking ball. In 1935, Luciano and his crew had no friends in Washington. No backroom deals with J. Edgar Hoover. No inside man in naval intelligence. The deal with the Office of Strategic Services didn't exist yet, nor did the CIA. These were still the early days. They weren't embedded in the system. They were a threat to it. And to put a bullet in Dewey. That wasn't strategy. That was madness. But later, after the indictment, after the headlines, after exile, Luciano would admit something else. Alone in Italy, stripped of his kingdom, he'd say Anastasia had been right. Dutch had been right. They should have killed Dewey when they had the chance. Because Dewey wasn't just chasing headlines. Luciano knew the look in that man's eyes. He wasn't out to make a name. He wanted a deal, or a body. By the time Luciano saw it, it was too late. Buying their way out wasn't an option. He called the commission, private meeting, Waldorf delicatessen, no press, no leaks. First time since the Maranzano hit. That something this volatile needed a full vote. And not a word was to reach Dutch. Too many old loyalties. Too many men who still owed him. Lansky laid down the rule. Only the Sicilians would vote. During a break, Lansky pulled Luciano aside. "Right now, Dutch is your cover," he said. You take him out and you're standing there naked. All that heat LaGuardia's throwing. It's coming straight at you next. Luciano got the message. He understood. But the clock had already run out. This is the kind of lesson Carlo Gambino was learning in real time. He wasn't at the table yet, but he was watching. He understood what Luciano had missed. When the press, the politicians and the cops were circling, you needed insulation. Layers. People who drew the spotlight while you stayed in the shadows. Schultz, loud, erratic, always making headlines, was Luciano's buffer. Killing him without a plan for Dewey left Luciano exposed. And Gambino never forgot that. By the time he took power in the 1960s, he made sure no one could see his hand. He understood what it meant to own the dark secrets of New York and keep them buried. The vote was cast. No objections. The commission had spoken. The contract went to Charlie Bug Workman, Luciano's old driver, now a trusted gunman. Schultz never saw it coming. On October 23, 1935, Schultz sat in the Palace Chop House in Newark with his men, Abe Landau, Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, and Abba Abadaba Berman. Schultz excused himself to use the restroom. Bug Workman and an unknown second shooter entered quietly. They moved to the back and opened fire. Landau, Rosenkrantz, and Berman fell in seconds. Bug walked to the restroom and opened the door. Schultz was at the urinal. One shot was enough. Workman turned and left without a word. The cleanup was bloody. The scene looked like Chicago in 1929. Schultz didn't die right away. He stumbled into the main room, collapsed, and lingered the next day. He never said who shot him. Never gave up anything. In the end, he took Catholic last rites. Charlie Workman was arrested more than 6 years later. In the middle of his trial, he changed his plea to guilty and took a life sentence. He served his time, and when he got out in 1964, Tommy Lucchese and Carlo Gambino helped him land a quiet job selling notions in the garment district. The murder of Dutch Schultz silenced a threat, but also removed the shield. Everything Lansky had warned about came to pass. And the attention turned, just as predicted, to the men who had tried to stay out of the light. By 1935, Carlo Gambino was no longer just a quiet presence at the table. He was managing a vast empire. His seat was permanent now, flanked by men like Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Frank Scalise, and other inner circle figures who moved through Luciano's orbit, like planets around a sun. Gambino didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened. He wasn't the loudest, but he was the most effective. He had become the vital cog in a machine that was swallowing New York whole. And he ran the Mangano operation like a boardroom, efficient, ruthless, and invisible. The Manganos had the docks. That meant everything: cargo, unions, payoffs, schedules, and silence. If it entered America, it passed through their hands. If it moved out, they blessed it first. Truckloads of product, legal and otherwise, paid tribute for the privilege of being touched by longshoremen under their control. What they built rivaled General Motors. It eclipsed U.S. Steel. The ports had become one of the biggest revenue-generating engines in the country. Gambino made sure it ran without friction, and through those docks, another current was flowing, quieter, deadlier. Aliens smuggled under the radar. Narcotics slipped between freight. Prohibition was over, but the real prohibition, the one on drugs, was still in place. And now the mob had the infrastructure to feed it. Heroin was flooding in from Corsican contacts overseas. Gambino kept the chain smooth and invisible. There were other demands too, expanding the racing wire, managing casinos, financing routes, buying union control block by block. And Gambino was inside all of it. If Luciano needed something moved, done, erased, or enforced, Gambino handled it. If Scalise needed labor pressure in Brooklyn, or the Manganos needed a message sent across the river, Gambino made the call. Murders were arranged when necessary. Payments were routed. Gambino kept the machine humming. But the heat was building. Tom Dewey had come alive. The death of Dutch Schultz had created a seismic shift. His empire had been broken up like an inheritance. Vito Genovese got a slice. Frank Costello took a piece. Joe Adonis. Tommy Lucchese. They all moved in, carving out chunks of what Dutch left behind. Schultz had worked closely with Lucchese on union rackets. Tight, structured, political. When he was gone, Gambino moved into the vacuum. He didn't come in loud. He didn't send muscle into Harlem to start wars. Instead, he played it like Arnold Rothstein once had. Quiet money. Clean financing. Let the local black racketeers continue running their operations, but back them. Prop them up with cash. No risk, no heat. The influence came through finance, not blood. Dutch Schultz had turned Harlem's numbers game into a polished machine. He streamlined operations, consolidated the patchwork of numbers banks, and became the layoff banker for the whole zone. If one bank was short, they went to Dutch. You paid him, or you didn't play. Even rival runners called him the monarch of policy. After he was gunned down in 1935, that throne didn't stay empty for long. Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, Trigger Mike Coppola, and the rest of Luciano's trusted men took control. The numbers racket was too profitable to be left to chaos. Gambino handled his end with a banker's touch. Coming into the later decades, men like Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family and Paul Castellano for the Gambinos would inherit the business. But it started here, under Gambino's eye, while the concrete was still wet. The black gangsters who had once depended on Schultz's financial safety net began doing the same. But now, instead of just paying for protection, they started financing themselves. Slowly, steadily, the power began shifting. But back in the 30s, Gambino's rise was cemented because he did what no one else did. He didn't skim. He didn't steal. He made sure the engine ran perfectly, and in doing so, he became indispensable. It was a time of deep recession, but the empire was thriving. It funded future wars, future schemes, and future generations of power. Gambino wasn't just a part of it. He was studying it like a man preparing to inherit the whole thing. But things were rumbling. He started to hear the whispers. Something was coming down in the Luciano camp. Washington wasn't satisfied with Schultz. Dewey wasn't stopping. They were going after all the old names from Prohibition. Anyone who made a fortune while the country drank in the dark was now fair game. And Gambino understood something most didn't. He saw that staying small, staying quiet, wasn't a weakness. It was protection. He wasn't on the front pages. He wasn't testifying. He wasn't giving quotes to reporters outside courtrooms. While the heat climbed, he was learning, watching how politics worked, how one man's ambition could ruin another man's empire, how the same senators who smiled at Luciano one year could send him to Sicily the next. This was where Gambino's real genius emerged. He studied it all, sat at the table, took notes, and said very little. What made Carlo Gambino a powerhouse wasn't just his silence, it was his positioning. He lived in the space between eras, the old country and the new world, and he understood both like they were languages. Men like Luciano had vision, men like Costello had access, but Gambino had patience, and that gave him reach. There were other names, older names, names that had power long before Luciano made his first dollar. In Buffalo, Stefano Magaddino ran his territory like a feudal lord, unbothered by flash, untouched by trend. In New Orleans, syndicates had been operating since the days of Storyville. When Costello came down south to talk shop with Huey Long, He wasn't just negotiating policy. He was buying permission. And that's where he met Carlos Marcello, a quiet enforcer rising in the shadows of a tightly sealed crime family. Marcello didn't need to talk. He had backing. Costello walked out with respect, and with that came a handshake and a deal. But not every city opened its arms to New York. In Tampa, Santo Trafficante Sr. saw Luciano's rise for what it was reshaping of the underworld that didn't always honor its old roots. To men like Trafficante, the Mafia wasn't a business. It was blood. And while he didn't admire Luciano's ambition, he respected men who carried themselves the old way. Men like Gambino. Gambino never demanded anything. He never forced his way into a room. He just showed up, offered value, and made himself essential. Over time, an understanding began to form between Tampa and New York. Not through Luciano, not through Costello, but through men like Lucchese and Gambino, who held on to the Sicilian code while adapting to the American pace. When Santo Trafficante looked north, thinking about the future for his son, Junior, he didn't look for flash. He looked for structure. He looked to the men who understood how to play the long game. While the groundwork was being laid in New York, Gambino was already deep into the distilleries. Moonshine operations stretched from the rural South to the port cities of the Gulf. New Orleans, Tampa, and the bootlegging corridors of Alabama all came under the quiet protection of the Marcello and Trafficante regimes, and Gambino was building links to both. While Carlo Gambino was stitching together an empire in the shadows, he needed men who could do more than muscle or move numbers. He needed quiet professionals, diplomats in pinstripes, men who could sit in two worlds and be welcome in both. One of those men was Joseph N. Gallo. Born in Alabama around 1912, Gallo didn't fit the usual mold. He wasn't just another Brooklyn kid with a chip on his shoulder and a cousin on the docks. He came from the Deep South, and he carried that weight with him. His roots ran through New Orleans, deep into the syndicate controlled by Carlos Marcello and the Trafficante family in Tampa. Gallo wasn't connected. He understood the South, how its politics worked, how its cops could be bought, how its streets were paved in whispers instead of headlines. In the 1930s, he caught his first case, illegal gambling, New York. It didn't hurt him. If anything, it gave him pedigree. While others made noise, Gallo kept building. Over time, he carved out real power in the garment industry. He opened his own dress manufacturing company in Brooklyn, just like Albert Anastasia, another heavyweight who moved like thunder, but struck like lightning. Gallo became a fixture in the industry, eventually controlling the Greater Blouse, Shirt and Undergarment Association. He didn't just manage it, he ran it. It became one of the most effective fronts the syndicate ever touched, a legitimate seat of power that gave him leverage in labor, transportation, distribution, and protection. It made him indispensable. When Prohibition ended, and Gambino was shifting into illegal liquor, bootlegging retooled as moonshine, unlicensed stills, and distribution routes off the books, he needed a man who could connect the dots between New York, the South, and the ports of New Orleans. That man was Gallo, quiet, efficient, unshakable. By the 1960s, he was more than an operative. He was a statesman. In 1966, when 12 men believed to be the national command of the American Mafia were picked up at La Stella restaurant in Queens, Gallo was sitting right there with them. It was less than 5 miles from Idlewild Airport, close to the flight lines, but far enough for discretion. Gallo had no official title, no public notoriety, but to those who mattered he was known simply as the Don between Dons. He could move between families, mediate disputes, and carry messages that couldn't be written down. He was a man who could be relied on, by Marcello, by Trafficante, and most importantly, by Gambino. In a world of egos and grudges, Gallo's word was currency. By the time he passed in 1995, Joe N. Gallo had lived nearly 8 decades in silence and strength. To most, he was a ghost. To the few who mattered, he was granite. It wasn't just booze anymore. Narcotics were slipping through the docks, wrapped in burlap sacks and flour barrels. Aliens were moved like freight. Cash was laundered through fish markets and olive oil fronts. The ports, once just a labor racket, became the artery through which the new empire flowed. Tampa, meanwhile, was already beginning to boil. By the late 1930s, the bolita racket had exploded. A localized version of the numbers game, it brought in millions in untaxed cash. Gambling in Tampa wasn't just tolerated, it was institutional. Bankers ran pickup crews across the city, and while there were no set territories, each player had his corner, his drop spots, his silent protection. Law enforcement didn't interfere. The whole system was built on the understanding that bribes came in faster than arrests. And when things got messy, when someone got too loud, too greedy, too ambitious, violence took care of the rest. It was an open secret. The newspapers ran the obituaries, but not the investigations. Jimmy Velasco, gunned down in 1948. Jimmy Lumia, executed in 1950. Ignacio Antinori, the godfather of narcotics in the region, murdered in 1940. The pattern was clear. The files weren't. In some cases, the Tampa Police Department didn't even bother keeping records. Case folders went missing. Eyewitnesses evaporated. Sometimes there wasn't even a suspect, just a body and a rumor. By the mid-1940s, the federal government started to take notice. The violence in Tampa wasn't random. It was organized, and it wasn't local. It had links to New Orleans, Chicago, New York. A gun used in a Florida hit turned out to be purchased 5 days earlier in Louisiana. Jack Dragner's personal phone book, when raided in Los Angeles, contained the direct number for Santo Traficante and Jimmy Lumia. The whispers became headlines. Behind closed doors, men like Gambino were watching the temperature rise. The press was starting to print words like Mafia. Senators were getting letters from citizens. And in Washington, investigators were quietly pulling threads. As early as 1946, agents noted the patterns. The same payoffs, the same violence, the same silence. And through it all, Gambino watched how men like Marcello and Traficante held their power. Not by shouting, but by owning silence. When Santo Traficante Sr. sent his son to New York, it wasn't an act of protection. It was a placement, a strategic deposit. Tampa had its rules, but New York was the proving ground. If Junior was going to have weight in the future, he needed to be molded by the best: Lucchese, Gambino, Adonis. Men who didn't just run rackets, they ran cities. And so the kid from Ybor City, born in 1915, started to shadow the men who were quietly shaping the underworld. No headlines, no shootouts, just the grind, labor, loans, liquor, logistics, the architecture of racketeering. And the most valuable education he could get wasn't in narcotics or gambling. It was in garments. In New York, the garment district wasn't just a business. It was the bloodstream. Every thread, every stitch, every truckload of fabric moved under the watch of the Mafia. The unions, the trucking lines, the distribution warehouses, all of it was touched. And at the center of it were the quiet operators, Joe N. Gallo, Paul Castellano, and a young, watchful Carlo Gambino. Gallo was already cemented, running the Greater Blouse, Shirt, and Undergarment Association, turning garment manufacturing into a protected empire. Castellano was still raw, but learning. Traficante Jr. fell right in line. He listened. He learned. He followed. The connection between these men wasn't just business. It was brotherhood. Gambino saw promise in the son of Tampa's boss, a kid who had been sent not just to observe, but to absorb. Traficante began moving like one of their own. The South and the North weren't in competition. They were forming an axis: Havana, Tampa, Miami, New York. a criminal corridor built on mutual respect and shared blood. As the late 30s rolled on, transportation became the backbone of American commerce. Goods and men were moving in ways the country had never seen before. From New York to New Orleans, through Pennsylvania, and down into the Deep South, new roads were being paved, highways stretched across the land, and the Mafia followed every inch of it. The web stretched coast to coast. Carlo Gambino, Joe N. Gallo, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Tommy Lucchese, the Detroit Partnership, the Chicago Outfit. Every major player found a way in. And it all began with gas stations. To the average eye, it looked like economic growth, filling stations popping up along highways, glowing neon signs in the night. But beneath those pumps was one of the most quietly powerful rackets ever built. The Mafia began buying and building gas stations not for visibility, but for control. It was a natural extension of what they already knew. These were the same men who had spent years running liquor across state lines during Prohibition. They knew the back roads, the fuel stops, the stretches of highway where trucks were forced to pull over. They knew where new construction was happening and where the money needed to go to keep palms greased. So they followed the route and built around it. Not just gas stations, but ecosystems, motels, roadside diners, underground casinos, brothels hid behind storefronts. Narcotics moved through service garages under the cover of night. Every vice had its place, carefully positioned along the very routes they once ran with bootleg trucks. It wasn't just about fuel, it was about infrastructure, control, territory. These fueling posts became hubs for laundering money, moving stolen fuel, and distributing contraband across regions. Luciano, even from prison, was hearing about it. What made the whole operation so effective was leverage. The Mafia controlled the unions, truckers, dock workers, pipeline crews. With that kind of grip, they could skim fuel right from the source. In states like Pennsylvania, Louisiana, and Texas, where oil flowed heavy and local consumption was high, they siphoned off millions of dollars in fuel. They sold it to their own gas stations, their own fleets, their own transportation companies. It was a closed loop: steal, sell, move, and profit, without paying a cent in tax. The profits were staggering. They saved millions reselling to themselves and made millions more selling to the public. No shutdowns, no slowdowns. The books were cooked. Inspectors paid off. The network stayed airtight. For decades it ran in silence, and even today, some of the descendants of those original gangsters still control parts of the chain. Marcello, Gambino, Lucchese, Trafficante. They weren't just mobsters anymore, they were industrialists. In Chicago, Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo were building their own empire off the same template. This was the beginning of a new era. The days of dice games and extortion were giving way to something bigger. The mob was laying the foundation of an underground economy. By the 1940s, that foundation was solid. Then came the war. When the Second World War broke out, ration stamps were introduced. In Europe, it was survival. People starving while their nations fed the front lines. In America, it was precaution. Goods were rationed just in case, creating artificial scarcity. And that's all the Mafia needed. Carlo Gambino moved fast. He already controlled oil, garments, produce, and meat. Now, with ration stamps, he turned scarcity into gold. He hijacked supply chains, inflated prices, and sold ration stamps on the black market. Meat that should have sold at market price now sold for triple. Canned goods vanished from shelves and reappeared in mob-run warehouses. Gambino didn't move product out of patriotism. He moved it for profit. It wasn't just theft. It was economic warfare. And he made a fortune. Then came the 1950s, and with them a new evolution: industry partnerships. Oil executives saw what the Mafia had: distribution, protection, reach. And instead of resisting, they welcomed it. Smaller companies got swallowed up. Larger firms made quiet deals. The result was quiet consolidation. Monopolies formed in the shadows, powered by mob muscle and protected by silence. And with the rise of the Central Intelligence Agency, those operations found even more cover. In the name of national security, the lines blurred further. Then came the next frontier: aviation, new technology, new money. And once again, the Mafia moved early. They started investing in companies that made aircraft parts, engineering firms, and aviation manufacturing plants. Whether it was for the military, commercial airlines, or private aircraft, it didn't matter. Where there was motion, there was money. And where there was money, the Mafia planted its flag. With the Teamsters in their pocket and labor in their grip, they embedded themselves in the future of American transportation. They weren't just adapting to change. They were shaping it. Carlo Gambino sat in the shadows, listening. The room was quiet, save for the rustle of a newspaper in his lap. The Miami News, bold type screaming about the attempted assassination of Senator Huey Long. But Gambino wasn't shocked. He was intrigued. Something was unfolding in Louisiana blood-soaked drama of power, politics, and betrayal. And Gambino, who had been quietly building his empire in New York, was studying every move like a master thief casing a bank. To the public, Huey Long was the kingfish, the populist messiah of the Deep South. But to men like Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, and Carlos Marcello, he was something else entirely: a gatekeeper. Louisiana wasn't just a state, it was a kingdom. And Long, with his share the wealth gospel and his iron grip on Baton Rouge, held the keys to it all. By 1935, Long's reach stretched from the governor's mansion to the United States Senate, where he had taken a seat without ever really letting go of the reins back home. Oscar Allen sat as governor in name only, a pawn whose loyalty to Long was so complete that he once answered phones as the kingfish presided from his office chair. From New Orleans to Shreveport, the line between elected office and organized crime blurred to the point of vanishing. This was what fascinated Gambino: the fusion of state and syndicate. In Louisiana, the government wasn't infiltrated by the mob. It was the mob. The Marcello brothers didn't need to muscle their way in. They were born into the system. Frank Costello had brokered deals there, greased palms, built bridges between Tammany Hall and the Cajun backwaters. But even Costello, for all his tact, tread carefully around Huey. Because Huey Long didn't make deals, he made demands. And so, when Gambino read that on September 8, 1935, Long walked into the Louisiana state capitol to gerrymander Judge Benjamin Pavey out of power and left with a bullet in his gut. He knew the game had changed. The assassin, Carl Weiss, fired point blank. The Kingfish's own skull-crushing bodyguards returned fire 60 times. They turned Weiss into pulp right there on the marble floors of the Louisiana state capitol. But it didn't matter. The Kingfish was mortally wounded. It had all the hallmarks of a setup. The famous Louisiana patsy method. A man lured into believing he could strike only to be executed on the spot before he could speak a word. Weiss thought he would walk out alive. He probably even believed Huey would be alone, that the area was secure. He had no idea the moment he pulled the trigger, he was a dead man. Gambino had seen this technique before, in Sicily. Now he was watching it play out in America. Who had orchestrated it? Why it happened the way it did? He didn't know. What he also did not know was that one day, not far off, he'd be shaking hands with the very men who had made it happen. As Long was rushed to Our Lady of the Lake Hospital, Gambino read about how the surgeons worked through the night, how blood was transfused, how the state's entire medical elite gathered by his bed like priests awaiting a deathbed confession. Long, always theatrical, whispered his final words. "What will happen to my poor university boys?" Or maybe it was, God, don't let me die, I have so much to do. The papers couldn't agree. What Gambino saw, through all the sentimental ink, was this. Huey Long had built a criminal political machine that rivaled any Mafia outfit in America. His assassination wasn't just the end of a man. It was a warning. When power becomes too centralized, when the people turn a blind eye, when the state itself becomes a racket, the only exit is a bullet. He noted how Abe Shushan, Long's campaign financier, broke down sobbing in the hospital corridor. He saw how Long's political successors scrambled to seize the throne before the kingfisher's body was even cold. Long's death would spark a temporary vacuum, but it wouldn't last. Because Long had done something none of the gangsters in New York ever dreamed of. He had made himself the law. And then it happened on a quiet evening at the Waldorf Towers. Late March, 1936. Outside, Manhattan was wrapped in a cold mist, the kind that smothered sound and made the city feel like it was holding its breath. Up in the suite, Charlie Luciano, still going by Mr. Ross to hotel staff, was alone when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was hushed but sharp. It was the front office manager, the same one who pocketed $200 a month for discretion. Tonight, that payment paid off. "Charlie," the manager whispered, "they're on their way up." Detectives, I think. Something's going down. Luciano didn't even wait for a second sentence. He dropped the receiver and moved. No suitcase, no toothbrush, just the clothes on his back. He didn't head for the lobby. He slipped through the freight elevator like a ghost, out the back into the shadows of the service alley. Across town, word traveled fast. By the time Carlo Gambino heard, Luciano was already gone. The whispers came in through the cracks. Charlie skipped, the Waldorf's hot, Dewey's moving in. For Gambino, it wasn't just a rumor. It was confirmation of everything Lucchese had warned him about. The net was closing, and the big names were already on the board. In Philadelphia, Luciano surfaced just long enough to switch cars with Nig Rosen, a Cadillac with Tennessee plates, and borrow $25,000 on a personal IOU. Then he slipped south, stopping only to buy a new wardrobe. Jacob Reed and Sons, quiet, discreet. Everything old-school gangsters liked. He rolled through Cleveland, then ditched the car and rode the rails like a fugitive to Arkansas place that didn't ask questions. Oni, the killer Madden, ran Hot Springs like it was his own private kingdom. Gangsters called it an underworld spa, massages in the morning, craps in the afternoon and cocktails by sunset. Luciano was safe there. For now. Back in New York, the heat was rising. Papers were sniffing around. Cops were lurking at known spots. Politicians were throwing phrases like vice crackdown and moral crusade into speeches. And in all of this, Carlo Gambino didn't move, didn't blink, didn't speak. He was watching the lesson unfold. This was no longer about bullets and broads. This was about headlines. Headlines that turned into subpoenas. Subpoenas that turned into trials. And trials that ended with men like Luciano being carted away in shackles while the real operators slipped into the background. It was March 1936. February had passed without much fuss. The kids were still playing with their gifts from Christmas. The city was buried in frost and fog. Carlo Gambino was home, quiet, where he liked to be, sitting on the carpet, watching his daughter giggle as she tried to balance a wooden block tower on a cushion. Then came a knock. Tommy Lucchese. Not scheduled, not expected. Gambino's wife answered the door, greeted him like an old friend, though she gave him that glance. The kind that said, "Another visit?" She didn't ask questions. She just let him in and turned back toward the kitchen. Lucchese stepped softly through the apartment, past the foyer, past the coats, straight into the room. Gambino turned his head, smiled, stood up, wiped his hands, and gave Tommy a half embrace. They sat at the table. Lucchese didn't waste time. "Have you heard?" he asked. Gambino shook his head. "You're not hearing it." Tommy leaned in. "It happened last night." Gambino's eyes narrowed. "What happened?" Tommy looked around the room and then dropped his voice even lower. "You need better ears on the street, Carlo. You've got good soldiers, smart ones, but no messengers. You've got no bellboys, no reception clerks, nobody in the goddamn post office. That's where the news lives now. That's where they talk." Gambino didn't blink, but he was listening now. Tommy went on. "You want to know who's making moves. You want to know who's been arrested, who checked into what hotel under what name, who's writing letters to Washington. It's not the wise guys on the street you need. It's the porters, the concierges, the valets, the guys who carry bags, move mail, make change, and keep their mouths shut. That's your KGB, my friend." Gambino gave a slow nod. Tommy leaned in closer. "If you get 'em loyal, and I mean loyal, and if you pay 'em well, they'll call you before the cops ever do. They'll let you know when someone's asking questions. Or if some broad from Kansas is whispering your name while climbing into bed with a T-man. That's your early warning system. That's how we survive what's coming." Then Tommy pulled something from his coat pocket. A folded newspaper clipping, still slightly damp from the rain. He slid it across the table. Gambino picked it up, read it. It was Charlie Luciano. The headline was small, tucked into the corner, but the meaning behind it was massive. Arrest, raid, vice charges. Gambino exhaled through his nose. That's when Tommy said it. "They're coming for us, Carlo. They started with Dutch. They've moved to Charlie. Washington doesn't care how long you've been out of bootlegging. They want a body, and you better start thinking like a general now, not just a boss. Because the next war isn't on the street. It's in the courts, in the papers, on the radio." And just like that, the warmth of the room vanished. The toys on the floor looked smaller. The carpet felt thinner. And Gambino, who had spent years building quietly, loyally, knew in that moment the rules had changed again. The moment came with the full force of a declaration of war. On April 1st, 1936, Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey dropped the hammer and branded Charles "Lucky" Luciano as public enemy number 1 in the city of New York. He wasn't just sending a message. He was drawing a line in the sand. The blue-ribbon grand jury that had spent months unraveling the filth of the city's vice operations finally spoke, and their indictment read like a census of underworld filth. Peddlers of flesh, pimps, loan sharks, enforcers, bail bondsmen who made their fortune trading in the futures of broken girls. Names poured out of the jury box like a hit list. Peter Belitzer, alias Peter Harris. David Marcoux, alias Davis Miller. Al Weiner, Jack Ellenstein, James Frederico, listed as the roving field director of the racket. Jesse Jacobs and Maya Berkman, accused of posting bail for working girls like they were racehorses. Ralph Ligori, a brute who kept the girls in line. Benny Spiller, the ring's money man. Abe Warman, the one they called the Hammer. Thomas Pinocchio, the quiet treasurer with bloody hands. And standing at the top of this sordid empire was little Davy Batillo, the man behind the curtain. But the biggest name, the name that changed everything, was Luciano. The jury didn't just name him, they anointed him as the architect of it all. He wasn't just a mob boss anymore. He was, according to the state of New York, the single force behind a nationwide system of forced prostitution. 90 counts. Later it dropped to 62, but it hardly mattered. The noose was tied. What nobody in Dewey's office could have known was that this moment would also mark the first time the name Carlo Gambino quietly crossed the threshold from footnote to heir apparent. Gambino, discreet, calculating and watching, saw firsthand how the old guard was being hunted. And he took notes. 2 days later, while most assumed Luciano had vanished into some Sicilian mist, He was instead walking calmly along the bathhouse promenade in Hot Springs, Arkansas, arm in arm with Herbert Akers, the city's chief of detectives. It was almost comedic. A man hunted across state lines, his face plastered in headlines coast to coast, was vacationing in broad daylight with law enforcement on his arm. It wasn't a New York cop who caught him. It was a Bronx detective named John Brennan, who had come to town chasing a completely unrelated murder. Brennan spotted him by chance and blinked twice, unsure if he was hallucinating. There, in full view of the springtime crowd, was Charlie Lucky himself. Brennan stopped him, told him the heat was on, that the entire country was looking for him, and then, like a Sunday school teacher, he suggested that Luciano come quietly. Luciano later laughed about it. "That was the craziest suggestion I ever heard in my life," he said. "I was having a good time. The weather was nice. Gay Orlova was with me. I wasn't about to take a train back to New York and walk into a trap." But Brennan, ever the Boy Scout, explained he had no choice. If word got out that he saw Luciano and let him walk, his badge was finished. So, the call went to New York. And that's when Dewey really began twisting arms. Extradition requests went out like gunshots. But Arkansas wasn't New York. Hot Springs wasn't just a town. It was a sanctuary. Luciano had friends there, powerful ones. Oni Madden, former bootlegger turned Southern aristocrat, came up to the suite personally. He told Charlie not to worry. "They got to hold you a few hours, that's all. It's all set. You'll go down to the courthouse, wave at the judge, and be back in time for cocktails. As for extradition, forget it. We'll fight it. With our friends here, it'll never stick." True to Madden's word, Luciano went before Chancellor Sam Garrett and walked out on $5,000 bail. Bail paid not by lawyers or family, but by the Southern Club and the Belvedere, two of Madden's finest casinos. Then he went back to his hotel suite like it was nothing. As if the whole thing were a minor inconvenience, the state of Arkansas wrapped him in silk. But Dewey wasn't going away quietly. He bombarded Arkansas's governor, Marion Futrell, with letters and press conferences. "Luciano is the most important racketeer in the country," Dewey declared. "And this case involves one of the largest, most loathsome rackets in existence." It wasn't just a crime. It was a moral rot at the center of the American experiment. The pressure worked. Embarrassed, Governor Futrell ordered Hot Springs to hold Luciano for formal extradition hearings. So again, police arrived apologetic this time, and again, Luciano returned to the courthouse. This time they lodged him in a cell. But the jail was just an office with bars. The sheriff told him, "Anything you need, Charlie. Just let me know. If you want to use my office phone, you can. Do you want to see people? No problem. Do you want company? Bring Gay over." From behind those bars, Luciano began plotting. Madden came by. Lawyers flew in from New York. Among them was Moses Polakoff, one of the sharpest legal minds on the East Coast. Together, they launched a campaign against Dewey. "This is politics," Luciano told the reporters with fire in his eyes. "The dirtiest kind of politics. I may not be a saint, but I've never stooped to that kind of filth." But his press statements only reached the public in fragments. The wire services printed Dewey's lines like scripture. Luciano's words, no matter how defiant, landed like whispers in a hurricane. "I wasn't looking for publicity," he later said, "but I didn't like that my trial was already being tried in the papers." For a while, it looked like he would beat it. Hot Springs had always protected its kings. The local economy thrived on gambling, girls, and entertainment, and Luciano was one of its biggest patrons. The mob had turned the city into a resort town with velvet ropes and dirty money. Extradition was stalled. The hearings were delayed. The climate in Arkansas was hot, not just in temperature, but in loyalty. But Dewey would not be denied. He sent out dispatches. He worked the federal angle. He poured gasoline on public opinion. Meanwhile, back in New York, the grand jury was still working, expanding the indictment, circling the entire Luciano network. Even Billy Ward, a defiant and saucy madam, took the stand and testified about Pittsburgh millionaires visiting May Scheibel's brothel, how girls were locked in, robbed of their money, and held under padlock. The underworld was rotting from the inside out, and Dewey was pulling up the floorboards. Then came whispers of forgery. A Brooklyn lawyer named Leon Fishbein had tried sneaking into the Tombs prison with a fake court order to see a Luciano associate. Justice McCook didn't flinch. He referred Fishbein to the Bar Association and the Appellate Division. The noose was tightening. Dewey was getting closer. By April's end, arrests of Luciano and Johnny Torrio marked what many in law enforcement saw as the end of an era. The old bosses, Dutch Schultz, Waxy Gordon, Joe Montana, were either dead or gone. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the ghost in the room. A quiet Sicilian with sleepy eyes and a thin smile. Carlo Gambino, the student, was watching it all unfold. He wasn't ready to rule yet, but he was learning how empires fall. It was the end of March 1936, and something cold had crept into New York City. Not the wind, not the weather, something worse. Tommy Lucchese showed up at Carlo Gambino's home without ceremony. No smile, no pleasantries, just a message heavy enough to freeze the blood of anyone smart enough to hear it right. He walked past Gambino's wife, nodded politely, and joined the old-school Sicilian in the kitchen. Gambino was at the table, gently bouncing his young daughter on his knee. Lucchese didn't sit. He just said it. They got lucky. The air changed. Gambino stopped moving. They're saying Dewey got him in hot springs. Real quiet. Whole operation was wired. He ran, but they found him strolling like it was Coney Island. At the Waldorf Towers, lucky Luciano had felt the ground crack before the storm. One call from the front desk tipped him off that trouble, dressed like detectives, was on the way up. He skipped the elevator, took the freight lift, and bolted. From New York to Philadelphia, then Cleveland, then Arkansas, Lucky ran like a man who wasn't used to running. He landed in Hot Springs, protected by Oni Madden and the old bootlegger sanctuaries. He thought he'd vanished into luxury. Instead, he walked straight into the arms of the law. On April 1st, the papers screamed the headline, "Public Enemy Number 1." Dewey wasn't done chasing ghosts. This wasn't a mob hit. This was political war. A young Republican prosecutor had declared war on the underworld, and now he had Luciano's name on the marquee. The Daily News lit up front pages. Jail Luciano as kingpin of vice in city. It was the biggest catch of the year, the crown jewel in Dewey's crusade. The charge, compulsory prostitution, 62 counts of it. The evidence, whisper networks of madams, pimps, enforcers, and little whores flipping on their handlers. Names like Little A.B. Warman, Davy Batillo, Peter Belitzer, and Jack Ellenstein filled out the roll call. But Dewey had bigger plans. The spotlight would shine on Luciano, and stay there. Meanwhile, in New York's underworld, the reaction was panic wrapped in silence. Gambino, Lucchese, Adonis. They all understood what this meant. The arrest of Luciano wasn't just a bust. It was a declaration of intent. If Lucky could go down, no one was safe. The playbook was changing. Back in Hot Springs, Lucky's first arrest was almost polite. A soft bail of $5,000, a hotel suite, fresh clothes, but it didn't last. When Attorney General Carl Bailey learned of a $50,000 bribe attempt by one of Madden's men to kill extradition, he exploded. "It must be demonstrated," Bailey announced, "that the honor of Arkansas is not for sale for blood or money." Dewey fired telegrams like bullets. The April 2nd Daily News mocked the soft bail. New York was furious. Bailey, under pressure, ordered Luciano transferred to Little Rock for extradition. But Hot Springs didn't want to let him go. It took 20 armed Arkansas Rangers, a standoff, and a surrender ultimatum before Luciano was moved. Luciano arrived in Little Rock like a defeated general, manacled, flanked by detectives, guarded by rangers with machine guns. The hearings were over before they started. His own lawyer, Moses Polikoff, said it straight. "You made it worse by running. You look guilty." Luciano fired back. "You think I'm going to walk into Dewey's trap? Let him have my head on a platter?" In New York, the headlines weren't kind. The April 16th issue of the Daily News ran a sidebar. "Court cites lawyer for Tombs forgery." Even Luciano's friends were caught forging passes to see witnesses. The walls were closing in. By April 27th, the Oregonian painted it as the death of the old gangs. Schultz, dead. Cole gunned down. Waxy Gordon behind bars. And now Luciano and Torrio, the last titans, shackled and awaiting trial. The article said the mobs were leaderless. The streets had gone quiet. But Tommy Lucchese, Tom Galliano, Santo Trafficante Sr., as well as Junior, Silver Dollar Sam, Russell Buffalino, Vincent Arlo, and Carlo Gambino all knew better. He was watching, not retreating. In the fall of 1935, when Huey Long was gunned down in the Louisiana state capitol, the news barely rippled through the dark corners of the underworld, except for the few men who understood what that kind of hit meant. Gambino was one of them. He said little, but his silence was louder than most men's speeches. These were the kinds of killings that triggered ancient memories that stretched back to the sun-baked streets of Palermo, where power changed hands at the tip of a stiletto, and a politician's life wasn't worth the paper his bribe was written on. To the old-world mafiosi like Gambino, Luciano, and Anastasia, killing a politician wasn't shocking. It was strategy. You removed one man only if you had another ready to step in, to take the heat, redirect the story, and keep the machine running. It was the kind of precision the Sicilian clans had practiced for over a century. In Louisiana, they did it quickly. The shooter was dead within minutes, and that was that. But in New York, killing a politician was like dropping a bomb on Fifth Avenue. The fallout was endless. Every newspaper, every radio, every hack with a pen turned their eyes to the scene. Gambino knew that. Luciano felt it in his bones. Luciano always had a sixth sense, a gambler's intuition fine-tuned by a decade of surviving Prohibition. His first big hunch was to unite the rackets, not by blood, but by brains. Italians, Jews, Irish, even the black numbers runners. He saw the future of crime as a business. Then Roosevelt came along. Luciano didn't trust him, not for a second. Something about FDR made Charlie twitch, like he was dealing cards from under the table. But it didn't matter. Roosevelt had the country in his pocket, and the country had a short memory. They'd loved the bootleggers when the gin was flowing. Now they wanted saints. Still, the real danger wasn't in Washington. It was in New York, and it had a name, Tom Dewey. Luciano didn't buy the story that Dewey was only after a few pimps and madams. He had a hunch, and Charlie's hunches were rarely wrong, that Dewey wasn't out to just lock him up. He wanted the whole empire. And what terrified them wasn't just what Luciano had done, it was what he had become. He and his crew, Costello, Lansky, Adonis, Gambino, they weren't just gangsters anymore. They were empire builders. They backed unions, took over shipping lines, controlled casinos, knocked down companies that didn't play ball. And behind every labor victory and every improved wage was a shadow, the Mafia, pulling the strings. That made them dangerous. The sit-down was called the Waldorf Towers. Luciano was out on bond, thanks to Costello's muscle and Adonis's money. Gambino was quiet, seated near the back, listening. Anastasia was already boiling over. He owed Luciano, Charlie had yanked him out of death row more than once. And now he wanted to repay the favor with blood. The room was filled with power. Lansky, Siegel, Costello, Adonis, Lucchese, Torrio. Gambino, as always observed, read the room like a priest hears confessions. There were jokes, laughter, wisecracks about Luciano's parade of broads turning on him. "You must be a lousy lay, Charlie," Anastasia cracked, slapping him on the back. Benny Siegel tossed in a line about making it a movie. "Suck and tell," and the room roared. But then Polakov walked in. He wasn't laughing. His face was sour enough to peel paint. The room went dead quiet. He didn't waste time. Dewey's indictment, he said, wasn't smoke. It was a loaded gun. The precision, the effort it took to bring Charlie back to New York, it meant something. And the jokes? They were over. They had to get serious. Really serious. Luciano gave him the nod. "Do whatever you gotta do. It's not gonna be cheap, Charlie. Fuck the money." In the end, the case would bleed Luciano's war chest for over $700,000. But the cost wasn't just cash. It was paranoia, silence, and strategy. Polakov wasn't a courtroom guy. He was a chess player. He brought in George Morton Levy to lead the courtroom attack, and Levy brought in Francis W.H. Adams, ironically, Dewey's own successor as U.S. Attorney. Years later, Adams would reinvent himself as the iron-willed police commissioner of New York. But here, in this smoky room of criminals and kingmakers, he was just another hired gun. When Polakov left, there was a long silence. Then Anastasia leaned forward. "We gotta knock off Dewey. It's the only thing to do. Charlie, I'll do it myself. No slip-ups. And it'll be a pleasure." There were nods around the room. Quiet ones. Dangerous ones. But Luciano waved it off. "That ain't the way. Not now. Not cops. Not district attorneys. We made that rule in Chicago. You remember." Gambino watched as Anastasia clenched his jaw and backed down. He didn't like it, but he understood. The meeting dragged into the night. Talk of funds, of informants, of surveillance and smear campaigns. Officially, it would be a legal battle. Unofficially, anything was on the table. Luciano didn't believe the case would stick. Not on prostitution. Everyone in power knew better. The cops, the pals, they knew Luciano, knew what he touched and what he didn't. Still, something in his gut itched. Dewey, he said later, had another angle. He just didn't know what it was. Anastasia muttered all night, "You're gonna regret it." Luciano did. He called it the #1 mistake of his entire life. The night before the trial, Polakov assembled the inner circle one more time. Adams laid it out. Dewey planned to parade a circus of prostitutes across the stand, one after another, each one saying Luciano was the boss, a pimp, a trafficker. Luciano chuckled. "Let 'em come," he said. "Once Levy and Adams tear into 'em on cross, the jury will be laughing 'em out of court." May 29th, 1936. The papers hit the streets like a burst of machine gun fire, headlines stacked with accusations, testimonies, and government spin. Lucky Luciano's name was splattered across every front page, and each paragraph bled deeper into the underworld's foundation. Carlo Gambino, always listening from the quiet periphery, didn't need to be in the courtroom to know what was happening. The men closest to the fire, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Tommy Lucchese, they brought him word by the hour, and what they brought wasn't good. The press had joined the prosecution. Dewey didn't just want a conviction. He wanted a public execution of Luciano's reputation, and they were giving him one. That Friday's Daily News cracked open with a poison-laced profile. "Booker's wife bears Lucky's debt slavery," screamed the headline. The redhead on the stand wasn't some fly-by-night floozy. Mildred Harris, now the bride of defense counsel David Siegel, was the new centerpiece in Dewey's star-studded theatre of shame. She wasn't just another madam. The prosecutors were painting her as a cornerstone of the syndicate's brain trust, the brains behind the Broads. Mildred recounted her desperate attempts to yank her husband out of the muck. "Not a chance," she claimed Lucky told her when she begged him to let her man go. "He's doing well, and he owes us money." That line slithered into the jury box and wrapped around the jurors like a noose. She told stories of meetings, names like Little Davy Batillo and Tommy the Bull Pinocchio, talks of $200 a week protection payments, and a bonding house that bled the girls dry. This wasn't just about vice anymore. This was organized machinery, and Dewey was positioning Luciano as the architect of it all. Even the housekeeping staff at the Waldorf turned against him. A chambermaid named Hedwig Schultz took the stand with a nervous smile and testified she cleaned Luciano's room every afternoon, long after the rest of the world had started its day. When she smiled at him in court and called him by his alias, Charles Ross, he smiled back. But that charm cracked when she pointed to Davy Batillo, Jesse Jacobs, and Maya Berkman as frequent guests to Luciano's luxurious apartment on the 39th floor. Dewey wanted the jury to believe that the empire was headquartered there, above Midtown, beyond reach, behind silk curtains and marble walls. Luciano's defense was desperate to restore dignity. They rolled out a cadre of gamblers and bookmakers who swore up and down that Lucky's business was the races, nothing more. They testified that he bet hundreds of dollars a day, that they'd never seen a madam or a prostitute in his apartment, just racetrack tickets and tip sheets. But the prosecution's blows had landed deep. By 6:40 that evening, after 60 witnesses and 3 weeks of grueling testimony, Dewey rested his case. And Lucky, on the courthouse steps, tried to smile for the flashbulbs. He told the press, "I certainly expect to be acquitted. I never met any of these people. I was never in this racket." But his lawyers weren't smiling. Privately, his attorney Polakov was already preparing for an appeal. He told Lucky it would cost a fortune. Lucky didn't blink. "Do whatever it takes," he told them. "Just beat this thing." Then came the question that hung over the courthouse like a loaded gun. Would Lucky Luciano take the stand? His lawyers urged him to stay seated. George Levy and Polakov were unanimous. Don't risk it. But Lucky, stubborn, proud, and boiling with rage at the lying Broads, insisted he had to go up there and tell his side. "I can handle that little prick," he said of Dewey. "I'll show them." On the morning of June 9th, Luciano took the stand, the final witness for the defense. Under Levy's guiding hand, he denied everything. Denied knowing the co-defendants, except Batillo. Denied knowing the girls. Denied ever seeing a cent from prostitution. He even lied about his birthplace, claiming East 13th Street in Manhattan. The lie slipped out, a bad reflex, a relic of old street instincts. His lawyers weren't quick enough to stop it. The courtroom was silent as Levy wrapped up. "Your witness," he said. And then Dewey stood. Luciano would later say that in that moment he had never been more afraid. Dewey didn't rush. He walked slowly, hungry. His face didn't show anger. It showed anticipation. He looked at Lucky the way a butcher looks at a pig he's about to gut. The cross-examination started with soft jabs, alias names, a concealed weapon charge in Miami, a half-joke about hunting in the Everglades. But then the barrage came. Year by year, Dewey marched through Luciano's criminal past, bootlegging, gambling, false names, false jobs. No legitimate work since 1920. Not even a sliver of honest income. Luciano tried to spin stories about a restaurant he once owned in 1929. "Oh," Dewey shot back, "the only legitimate business you had in 18 years. You forgot?" Then Dewey pulled up the beating, Staten Island, tape over the mouth, the ride. Luciano had told the grand jury one thing, the court another. Dewey forced the admission out of him. "So, you lied about that too?" "Yes." Then came the moment that turned stomachs. Had he ever been arrested for narcotics? Yes. Had he informed federal agents about a trunk full of heroin? Yes. "Didn't this make you a stool, Pigeon?" Dewey asked. Luciano's reply was defensive, but the sting was out there. He had talked. The air in the courtroom turned cold. Then Dewey went name by name. Louis Lepke Buchalter. Yes. Jake Gura Shapiro. Yes. Bugsy Siegel? Yes. Joe Masseria? Yes. Oni Madden? Yes. Al Capone? No, Luciano said. Dewey smirked. He produced phone records, calls to Capone's number in Chicago, calls to Solano's restaurant, which Dewey said was the headquarters of the Vice operation. Too many calls, too often. "Friends," Lucky said. "Good spaghetti." No one believed him. By the end of Dewey's interrogation, Luciano was a crumpled version of the cocky gambler who'd strutted into the courtroom weeks earlier. "I felt like I'd been through a washing machine," he said later. "My shirt was soaked. My legs were trembling. I ran out of that courthouse." In the night's papers, the headlines read, "Bad day for Charlie Lucky." But even that didn't capture the truth. This was a massacre. Dewey hadn't just questioned him. He'd peeled him open, page by page, lie by lie, until nothing was left but sweat and silence. When all the noise of the trial died down, the testimonies, the headlines, the whispers, the grand theatre of it all, Carlo Gambino just sat there, silent. He wasn't in the courtroom. He didn't need to be. The street gave him the play-by-play, the look in Tommy Lucchese's eyes, the tone in Adonis's voice, the flurry of anger in Anastasia's pacing. All of it painted a portrait of disaster in motion. But for Gambino, it wasn't just a public trial. It was a private revelation. Back in 1921, when he first arrived on American soil, he had been a young boy, no more than a silent shadow. Watching the rhythms of power play out like an orchestra, he was still learning to read. By 1925, he was looking up at Luciano through the fog of Frank Scalise's operations, watching this daring young Italian carve a kingdom out of vice, steel, and charisma. He wasn't just impressed. He was in awe. Luciano wasn't surviving. He was conquering. But admiration wasn't love. It was part envy, part confusion, and part warning. And now, in 1936, as Tom Dewey's voice echoed through the wires and the whispers, Gambino heard it. "Didn't that make you a stool pigeon?" A stool pigeon. The words rattled in his bones. Was Dewey calling Luciano a snitch? Was it true? Or was it just part of Dewey's elegant savage theatre trap to bait the jury, to bait the public, to bait history itself? The truth was more complicated. Gambino knew it. Survival wasn't about purity. It wasn't about code. It was about adaptation. Cunning, sure. Loyalty, yes, until it no longer served its purpose. There was no honor in getting buried. There was no glory in silence if it led to extinction. And in 1923, Luciano had been on the verge of extinction. He had been caught with narcotics, a felony that would have buried him in a prison cell forever if the courts had followed through. He would have been finished before his name even became legend. But instead of going under, Luciano found a crack in the system and crawled through it. Whatever he did, talk, deal, scheme, he did it to survive. From that moment on, the game changed. They started corrupting the very structure of New York. By the time the 30s rolled in, the Mafia wasn't just a street gang anymore. It was a parallel government. Police captains, commissioners, judges, they weren't enemies, they were assets. The New York City Police Department didn't fight the mob. It worked for it. They didn't raid the businesses. They protected them. But the trick, the real genius, was knowing when to feed the system, and that was the lesson Gambino carved into memory. You let the press have their victories. You give the district attorneys their headlines. You offer up a lamb, small, expendable, and let the lions devour it. You get the raid tip-off in advance. You clean house before they arrive. They walk in with cameras, seize a few worthless ledgers and bottom-rung soldiers, and walk out heroes. You keep the real machinery hidden and humming. That was survival. And betrayal? Betrayal was a myth told to wide-eyed soldiers. Loyalty was conditional. It lasted as long as it served a purpose. Gambino didn't say any of this out loud. Not to Adonis, not to Lucchese, not even to Anastasia. He just looked at Tommy, nodded slightly, an acknowledgement not of what was said, but of what had occurred. Luciano had done it in 1923. And if he had to, so could Gambino. But even this was kindergarten compared to what was coming. The real education hadn't even begun. Gambino was just finishing grade school. High school would be betrayal. College would be politics. And Harvard. Harvard would be what happened when the boss above him, Albert Anastasia, marched Louis Lepke Buchalter straight into J. Edgar Hoover's arms. That wasn't survival. That was strategy. And it made Luciano's 1923 gamble look like child's play. By the summer of 1936, there were no more illusions. The courtroom drama was over. The headlines had stopped screaming. The shutters had come down on the Luciano empire, or so it seemed. Inside one dimly lit apartment, Gambino sat at a table with his head in his hands. And he wasn't alone. Joe Adonis, usually the smoothest man in the room, had gone silent, chain-smoking as he stared out the window. Albert Anastasia, a man of uncontrollable tempers and deadly instinct, paced like a rabid panther, his mind spiraling between vengeance and desperation. Even the stoic Tommy Lucchese was rattled. But off in a dark corner, Vincent Mangano was smiling. Always watching, always calculating. He could see it now. Luciano, their fearless architect, had been crippled. Not dead, not dethroned, but buried alive in the frozen tomb of Dannemora, a prison so far north it may as well have been Siberia. To visit Lucky now meant trekking into a world of locked doors and cold steel. The boss had become a ghost behind concrete. His voice was now filtered through visitors' rooms and relayed by trusted couriers. To have a word with him required weeks of preparation, strings pulled, excuses crafted. It was like trying to hold a board meeting inside a mausoleum. Anastasia lost patience almost immediately. He wanted Lucky out before the cell door had fully shut. But Luciano knew better. This wasn't a street corner beef. This was the long game. He understood that to beat the system, he had to outlive the moment. That meant years of silence, years of planning, and a careful public erasure. His name had become radioactive. To save the man, they first had to bury the myth. And while the world shifted above, Carlo Gambino began his quiet ascent. He kept his head low, his name out of the papers, and his hands buried deep in opportunity. He didn't talk. He didn't posture. He built. Numbers, gambling, loans, construction, even the black market networks left over from Prohibition. Gambino picked them off piece by piece, like a scavenger turning bones into treasure. And when the commission needed funds for investments, Tommy Lucchese showed up with envelopes full of cash, half of which came directly from Gambino's pockets. He funneled money upward to Anastasia, outward to Lucchese, and sideways into every syndicate worth betting on. He was buying his future, $1 at a time. But money wasn't the only thing he was accumulating. He was watching men, measuring them, Lucchese's crew, Galliano's soldiers, even the outliers tucked into the Profaci outfit. Who had real loyalty? Who followed the structure? Who would answer a call in the middle of the night, no questions asked? Who could be bought, and who could be trusted? He didn't need dossiers. He didn't need surveillance. He had eyes, ears, and instincts. Lucchese was his rock. The two of them came from the same cloth, Palermo born, bred on blood and silence, fluent in the unspoken codes of loyalty. This was the new syndicate rising. The old lines had started to dissolve. Dutch Schultz, the wild cannon of the Bronx, had been erased with surgical efficiency. His kingdom, rackets, breweries, meat routes, and dirty money lines, was split like war spoils. Half of it fell to Vito Genovese, carving up territory like a warlord. The other half was a free-for-all, divvied between Profaci, Costello, Adonis, and Lucchese. But when it came time to actually run Dutch's tangled empire, it wasn't Genovese or Adonis who stepped up. It was Gambino. He didn't make speeches. He just started showing up. At the docks, in the butchers' unions, behind the gambling joints. He put men in place, ironed out disputes, and kept the flow moving. And no one stopped him. Meanwhile, up in the icy silence of Dannemora, lucky Luciano sat behind glass and steel, doing what he could to grip the ropes of an empire slipping through his fingers. He still issued orders, passed messages, and made decisions. His caretaker was Frank Costello. His banker was Meyer Lansky. His street general was Vito Genovese. Joe Adonis oversaw the Unione Siciliano. Together, they formed a sort of provisional government, sending emissaries upstate and coming down with Lucky's word stamped on their tongues. But then, Lansky disappeared. Weeks passed, no visits, no messages, and Luciano, restless in his cell, began to suspect something had shifted. Around Easter of 1937, Joe Adonis came in to see him. Luciano knew right away. Something was off. "Where's Meyer?" he asked. Adonis stalled, hemmed, then finally broke. "He's in Havana." "Havana." Lucky's face tightened. "He made a deal. With Batista. He's got the casino at the Hotel Nacional." The words hit like a slap. Luciano went cold. "He's gone solo?" he asked. Adonis tried to calm him. "He made the deal for all of us. Sugar, the casino, Cuba, just like you two talked about." Luciano's temper simmered beneath the surface. But he was no fool. He told Adonis to get word to Lansky and tell him to haul ass up to Dannemora. Within a week, Meyer Lansky was there, accompanied by attorney Moses Polakov for legal camouflage. Polakov sat far enough away to pretend he couldn't hear a word. Luciano cut straight to the point. "What's it all about, little man?" Lansky didn't flinch. "Cuba's ours," he said. "Just like we planned. Batista's in my pocket. I move his money, every dollar, every peso. He belongs to us, Charlie. You've got a piece, like always." Luciano relaxed, just a little. But Lansky wasn't done, his voice lowered. "I'm worried about Bugsy." "Benny?" Luciano said. "He's out in L.A. playing a Hollywood big shot, not just using the cover. He believes it. I'm telling you, Charlie, he's going to be a problem." Luciano sat back, chewing on those words. One partner out of reach in Havana, another turning into a starlet on the West Coast. The empire was intact, but only barely. Meanwhile, Gambino continued his silent climb. He wasn't in Havana. He wasn't on movie sets. He was in Brooklyn, in Manhattan, in Jersey, showing up for the things that mattered. The racks, the roots, the cash. By the end of the decade, it wasn't just money he was holding. It was power. The Italian Mafia had always been a violent business, born in blood and bred on betrayal. But as the decades passed, something strange began to happen. The wild dogs started dying off, at least the non-Italians did. The Jewish killers, the Irish thugs, the freelancers and freelancers turned fixtures. They either got clipped, got old, or got out. Dutch Schultz, for all his muscle, ended up in a New Jersey chop house with bullets in his gut and soup on his tie. And now another one was flying too close to the sun. Louis Lepke Buchalter. Luciano had always liked Lepke, not because of his brains, he didn't have many, and not because he was charismatic, he wasn't. But there was something old world and oddly sentimental about the man. In meetings, he talked about his mother with affection that felt almost sacred. And among Italians, especially the old ones, a gangster to whom honored his mother was a man worth listening. So, Lucky gave him a seat at the table, despite his reputation for violence. But Lepke, like Albert Anastasia, was a loaded gun without a safety. Dangerous alone, deadly together. Luciano, Costello, and Lansky, men who understood the value of diplomacy and restraint, had spent years keeping those two on a short leash. The rule was simple. No one dies unless we all agree. It wasn't about mercy. It was about optics, about stability, and about business. And it worked, until Luciano got shipped off to Dannemora. With Lucky out of reach and his deputies stretched thin across the country, Costello buried in New Orleans, Lansky knee-deep in Florida casinos and Cuban politics, there was no one left to hold the line. Lepke and Anastasia stepped into the void. And they didn't walk, they ran, like wolves finally off the chain. Luciano was busy focusing on his appeals, trying to claw his way out of a maximum security tomb when the first whispers began to arrive. Lepke was making moves. Big ones. He was telling people he wasn't breaking bread anymore. He was eating alone. The garment district, his. The bakeries, his. No cuts, no partners, no respect. It wasn't just arrogance, it was suicidal. By the summer of 1937, Louis Lepke Buchalter was living loud. Too loud. Flashy suits, wads of cash, his name turning up in the papers. The kind of attention no smart mobster ever wanted. That's when the nightmare landed. The feds had him cold narcotics. And not some nickel and dime junk deal. This was international. Heroin from Hong Kong routed straight to New York. $10 million worth. Even Luciano, already exiled from the day-to-day street grind, was stunned. "That stupid jerk," he said. "Up to his belly button in something he don't know a fucking thing about." Heroin was the one product that could bring everything down. Genovese had already stirred up enough heat with it. Now Lepke, greasy fingers and all, had dipped into the poison trade. Luciano considered letting him burn. He'd warned him, lectured him, tried to talk sense into him for years, but it was like shouting at a wall. Still, you didn't feed one of your own to the wolves, not unless you were ready to watch your own walls crumble with him. And there was another reason Luciano held back. He knew Lepke wasn't the only one sniffing around the drug trade. There were others. Anastasia, Joe, Adonis, Frank Scalise, a whole roster of old-school racketeers who'd fumbled their fortunes after Prohibition. They hadn't invested. They hadn't planned. Bootlegging was dead, but Prohibition still had its claws in other substances. Cannabis, heroin, opium, even cocaine. The demand didn't disappear. It changed. America was in the grip of the Depression. Long hours, no health insurance, no reliable medicine. People were hurting, and pain relief came however they could get it. Opium, morphine, those became lifelines. Not just for addicts looking to get high, but for desperate men and women trying to survive their work weeks. They were functioning junkies, quiet, miserable, and employed. That demand created opportunity, and the Italians and Jewish mobsters started moving in. Quiet at first, but the pipeline was growing, and soon, certain members of the newly emerging Office of Strategic Services, under men like Paul Helliwell, would start paying attention. That very same drug network would become useful to them. That's how it always worked. But in 1937, there was no shield, no protection. Lepke had gotten himself into something nobody was going to clean up. Not entirely. In this life, when you fall alone. Still, Luciano hesitated. A year earlier, in 1936, Dewey had humiliated him in court, branded him a stool pigeon. To hand over Lepke now on narcotics charges no less would only confirm it. It would mark him as a rat, and that was something Luciano couldn't afford. So he let Lepke disappear, let him hide. Protected him, for now. He just had to wait for the right moment, the right reason. And when it came, then and only then, Luciano would hand him over. So, Luciano gave the order, protect Lepke. Anastasia took the job personally. It wasn't just loyalty. The two were close, brothers in blood. Lepke vanished. December 1937. Gone. For 2 years the country lit up with wanted posters and breathless headlines. America's most dangerous criminal. Dewey put up $25,000. Hoover, furious that the spotlight was shifting away from him, added another $5,000 and declared Lepke public enemy number 1. The manhunt was nationwide. Circulars blanketed post offices and police stations. They said he was in Florida, Chicago, Cuba, Poland, the Far East. It was a global ghost story, but for Luciano and the underworld, there was no mystery. Lepke was in Brooklyn, at 101 3rd Street, under the personal guard of Anastasia. And he wasn't just hiding. He was operating, running rackets, calling meetings, sending out contracts. Lepke and Anastasia had activated the death engine known as Murder Incorporated, using their stable of killers to wipe out witnesses and burn evidence to ash. He was becoming a liability, even to his own. By 1939, the heat was unbearable. Federal agents were showing up at Lansky's doorstep in Havana. Costello's gambling halls in New Orleans were getting surprising visits. And then, the unthinkable, an FBI agent walked into Dannemora and asked Luciano for help. Hoover wanted a favor. Luciano couldn't believe it. I told the agent, he later said, if he'd commute my sentence, I'd hand him Lepke in 24 hours. No commutation, no Lepke. As far as I was concerned, Hoover could go fuck himself. And maybe that was a good idea. It was theater. But it was also real. Lepke was running wild. New York was turning into a battleground again, and worse, he was making the Italians nervous. His operation might have been topped by non-Italians, but its backbone, that was built on wise guys, real men of honor. They knew the rules, and they knew that the kind of heat Lepke was attracting could scorch them all. Just like Dutch Schultz before him, Lepke's clock had started ticking. Murder, Inc. was no longer in the shadows. The streets were talking. The feds were circling. A sit-down was called, one of the most significant meetings of that turbulent moment. Around the table were names that could shake the city. Frank Scalise, Albert Anastasia, Vince and Philip Mangano, Longy Zwilman, Frank Costello, Willie Moretti, and Gerardo Catena. But in the end, it was Lepke's attitude that finally pushed Tommy Lucchese, accompanied, as always, with Luciano's attorney, Moses Polikoff, to make the long trip up to Dannemora to see Charlie Luciano. 2 nights earlier, Lucchese had organized a meeting. Anastasia had brought Lepke along, and the room filled up with heavyweights. Lucchese, Moretti, Gerardo Rullo, the man who would later rise as Jerry Catena, a major caretaker of Vito Genovese's empire, Zwilman, and others. The purpose? To confront Lepke over his tightening grip on the garment district. Lucchese and his partners were being edged out, and they knew it. But Lepke didn't flinch. He told them flat out that the garment district belonged to him, and him alone. If anyone tried to move in, he'd fight. Then, in classic Lepke fashion, he stormed out and ordered Abe Kid Twist Reles to drive him straight back to his hideout. Now, sitting across from Luciano in the prison visiting room, Lucchese laid it out. "Ever since you've been gone," he said, "things ain't the same. I got the feeling Frank Costello's doing too much on his own. And that little genius Lansky, he disappears down in Havana, and we don't see him but maybe once a month. Charlie, you got to do something about this Lepke thing. Dewey and Hoover would give their left arms to grab him, and until they do, they're putting pressure on all of us. They ain't gonna let up." Luciano leaned back and thought it over. It felt like they were rewinding the clock, back to the days of Dutch Schultz. But killing Lepke like they did Dutch, that would only bring more heat. Hoover would explode if anyone stole his thunder, and Dewey would go through the ceiling. No, this time it had to be different. They had to get Lepke out of the picture, but it had to be clean. Let the government have him. Give Dewey and Hoover their trophy. So, Luciano made the call. "Get Meyer, Frank and Joe A. on it right away," he told Tommy. "And make damn sure Anastasia gets my message. He's done protecting Lepke. I don't want no arguments about it." "The way I figured it," Luciano would later say, "the most important thing was making Lepke believe we had a deal with Hoover." The plan was simple, at least on paper. If Lepke surrendered to the FBI and took the narcotics rap, Hoover would guarantee he wouldn't be handed over to Tom Dewey. And by the time he finished a federal stretch, Dewey's case would have collapsed under its own weight. Luciano knew what made Lepke sweat. The man was terrified of Dewey, especially after what that prick, as Luciano called him, had done to him. Of course there was no deal, not with Hoover, not with anybody, but it had to look like there was, airtight, unshakable. Luciano told Tommy Lucchese that the whole setup had to come from someone Lepke trusted. The man wasn't going to come out of hiding to see Luciano in Dannemora, and he didn't trust Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, or even Meyer Lansky. They needed a face he wouldn't question. So Luciano penned a sealed note to Lansky, handing it off to Moses Polikoff to deliver in New York. He laid out the entire blueprint. Once the surrender was arranged, Meyer and Costello were to make sure Dewey got wind of who orchestrated the entire operation, Charlie Lucky himself. Hoover would get Lepke first, then turn him over to Dewey, who'd take the credit. Luciano wanted Costello to reach out to Dewey's most trusted man and tell him that the whole outfit was ready to back Dewey in a future run for governor of New York. "I couldn't say no more about that part," Luciano wrote, "until I had all the details worked out in my mind." Lansky, sharp as ever, knew exactly who to send. Mo Dimples Walensky, a gambling persuader who had worked with both Meyer and Lepke. More importantly, Lepke trusted him. Walensky, unaware he was the Judas goat, went to find Lepke and sell the lie. 2 years underground, weighed down by paranoia and pressure, had softened Lepke just enough to make the offer seem like a lifeline. By early August 1939, word reached Luciano. Lepke was in on one condition. He would surrender only to J. Edgar Hoover himself, and the man who would drive him to the meeting had to be Albert Anastasia. But there was one last detail. Who would set it up with Hoover? 3 names floated to the top. William O'Dwyer, the politically boosted Brooklyn judge. Morris Novick, a squeaky clean assistant to Mayor LaGuardia. And Walter Winchell, the fast-talking gossip columnist with deep ties to Hoover. When Frank mentioned Winchell, I was ready to hit him, Luciano admitted. He remembered how the columnist had acted when he was still holed up at the Barbizon. But Frank explained it, and Luciano came around. Winchell was Hoover's pal, and if they used him, it would convince Lepke everything was legit. Besides, feeding Winchell the scoop of the century wouldn't hurt. "That kind of favor," Luciano said. He knew he had to repay. Luciano gave Frank the green light on Winchell. Then the talk turned to Dewey. They knew the son of a bitch wasn't content being district attorney forever. He'd already taken a swing at the governorship in 1938 and was making noise about running for president in 1940. "We figured he was too goddamn young for that," Luciano said. "I wanted him in Albany, where he could do me some good." Frank went back to New York carrying a promise. Dewey would have their full support for governor, and more. Lepke, gift-wrapped, complete with evidence. Just before 10 o'clock on the night of August 24th, 1939, a stifling, sticky Manhattan summer night, Albert Anastasia pulled up to 101 3rd Street in Brooklyn in a four-door sedan. He picked up a passenger, turned his collar, large sunglasses hiding his face, and drove over the Brooklyn Bridge into Manhattan. At the corner of 5th Avenue and 28th Street, they spotted a black, curtained limousine. Anastasia eased the car into position just behind it. The rear door opened. Lepke stepped out, exchanged a final word, and walked to the waiting limo. Inside was Walter Winchell behind the wheel. He opened the passenger door and looked hard at the figure in sunglasses. Then he turned to the stocky man seated in the back. "Mr. Hoover," he said, "this is Lepke." Hoover leaned across and opened the rear door. "How do you do?" he said, brusquely. "Glad to meet you," Lepke replied, sliding in beside the director. But any trace of relief vanished with Hoover's next words. There was no deal, no promises, no safe passage. Either Hoover didn't know about any arrangement, or he was pretending not to. Coldly, he told Lepke he'd be tried immediately on federal narcotics charges. And then, to Lepke's horror, he would be turned over to Tom Dewey, the same Dewey who had publicly sworn to bury him under 500 years of prison time. "I wanted to get out of that car as soon as I heard that," Lepke would later say. But it was too late. As Winchell switched on the headlights and pulled away, a fleet of black sedans filled with FBI agents appeared like sharks in a frenzy feeding. They surrounded the limousine and escorted it straight to FBI headquarters in Manhattan. Within weeks, Lepke stood in federal court on trial for narcotics conspiracy. He was sentenced to 14 years, but he barely had time to adjust to the iron bars before he was handed over to Dewey. The Manhattan DA wasted no time. He threw the book at Lepke: extortion, bakery rackets, organized labor crimes, and got the conviction he wanted. And the sentence? It nearly mirrored the one he'd won against Luciano: 30 years to life. Dewey's road to Albany had just been paved with the bones of another kingpin. Jesus Christ, forget being a stool pigeon. How about being a bald eagle ripping a deer off the ground and dragging it into the sky? That's what it felt like to Carlo Gambino when he realized what Luciano had just done to him. At first, it looked like betrayal. Then it started to look like evolution. Back in Sicily, there were no Jewish gangsters to hand over, just silence, blood, and loyalty. But in America, the game was different. Gambino started scratching his head. Was this treachery, or was it strategy? He already knew about Luciano's cooperation in 1923, and now this. The Mafia hadn't just survived the federal crackdown. They'd gone deeper. They hadn't just avoided Hoover. They'd brought him to the table. What Gambino came to understand was staggering. Wherever these men went, government agencies followed. And in return, those same agencies got something back. The Mafia made them look good. They helped them win. Take Cuba, for example, or South America, or the Bahamas. When world empires collapsed after the Second World War, a vacuum opened up, and the only people with ready money to invest were the mob. So they moved into London, into the Caribbean, into broken economies that were ripe for rebuilding. The Central Intelligence Agency noticed. They needed access to foreign banking, covert channels, and muscle. The Mafia had all three. When Benjamin Siegel moved into California, the mob grabbed more than gambling. They took hold of the studios, the unions, the girls, the streets. They controlled Hollywood. And Hollywood, by then, had become something bigger than movies. It was a propaganda tool. America had never fully realized that until the 1940s, when they started importing Nazis through Operation Paperclip, not for justice but for knowledge. They didn't want to punish them. They wanted to understand how the Nazi machine had convinced a nation to follow madness, to burn its own people, to gas the disabled, the unwanted, the Jews. Blue-eyed, blonde-haired people who looked no different than their neighbors were marked and destroyed because of one thing: propaganda. And America wanted that machinery for itself. The elite were fascinated. They wanted the men who built that machine, who knew how to move hearts and minds, and organized crime was going to be part of it, directly or indirectly. The FBI was already working with Hollywood to build Hoover's fake reputation. The G-men, the newsreels, the clean-cut lawman image, it was all theater, all fiction. Gambino was stunned when he learned the truth. It was Anastasia who had handed one of their own to the feds. Anastasia, Lepke's old friend. And that's when Tommy Lucchese leaned in, looked Gambino in the eye, and said quietly, "If we told you the truth, could you keep it to yourself?" Gambino nodded. Lucchese replied, "Our boy Hoover, he's not just a friend, he's a freak. Likes his face where it don't belong. Our friend Meyer Lansky's got people at those parties, Jewish boys who swing the same way. And they've been with Hoover. We don't just own him, we know him, intimately. He's one of us now. He'll protect our assets, back our moves. We got the Bureau, we got the state police, and every top cop in New York is in our pocket." And just like that, it all clicked. This wasn't betrayal. This was brilliance. Gambino realized he was right all along. In Sicily, all Gambino had was the streets. Here, they were building something bigger part of the system, not just in politics, not just with the judges and cops, but in real estate, in charities, in the unions, and now, in intelligence. They had Hoover, they had the Bureau, and the Sicilians were sitting on top. Tommy looked at Gambino and grinned. "You are learning a trick or two from Luciano." Gambino smiled. "More than a trick," he said. "If you're asking if I've started moving in on Lepke's rackets, then yes. I have. And one of the names he dropped was already in place. Joseph Riccobono, a trusted figure from Lepke's inner circle. The takeover had already begun. To build an empire, you didn't just stack bricks, you had to steal the blueprints. Carlo Gambino knew this. He didn't want to follow the Luciano model. He wanted to own it. And to do that, he had to learn exactly how Luciano built his throne, and how he managed to sit on it while the floorboards burned beneath him. Luciano hadn't just seized power. He infiltrated it. He'd entered the world of Joe Masseria as a young foot soldier, all smiles and silence, while quietly keeping warm ties to Salvatore Maranzano through back-channel whispers, Sicilian oaths, and shadowy messengers. Even before Maranzano crowned himself boss of bosses, Luciano had already embedded his men like seeds waiting to bloom, in every major family. The Mangano family, the Bonanno family, Galliano, Profaci, Maranzano's own, all filled with soldiers and captains who, when it came down to it, bled for Luciano. So, when he pulled the trigger on Maranzano in 1931, the war wasn't a war. It was a surrender. The chessboard collapsed because Luciano already owned the bishops, the knights, and half the pawns. Gambino watched. He understood. To inherit power, you didn't need a war. You needed people. The right ones, in the right place, at the right time. And when Dutch Schultz got laid out in the palace chop house, the same logic applied. Dutch left behind a sprawling empire of rackets. Numbers, breweries, bookmaking, bootlegging, trucking, meat, unions, and his demise had blown it all wide open. All Gambino had to do was move fast and smart. He joined forces with Tommy Lucchese, a man who understood the bones of Schultz's operation. They pulled Albert Anastasia and other Brooklyn and Harlem heavyweights. Overnight, the entire Dutch legacy was carved up and restructured, with Gambino and Lucchese holding a part of the map. What Luciano had done to Maranzano, Gambino was doing to Schultz, without the bloodbath. Dutch was already dead. All that remained was to take his skeleton and dress it in a new suit. But empires didn't run on muscle alone. Gambino was looking for minds, trusted minds. Men who could operate behind the curtain and manage the delicate balance of diplomacy, finance, and fear. One name emerged from the rubble of Lepke Buchalter's collapsing empire: Joseph Riccobono. The world knew him as a minor figure, a collector, an errand man for the Buchalter-Shapiro machine. But Gambino saw something else. Riccobono had vanished for 7 years. Gone. Fugitive. Ghost. And then, like a character from a bad novel, he reappeared in November of 1944, walked straight into the district attorney's office in Manhattan with a high-priced lawyer and a smirk. Joseph Riccobono, age 50. Indicted alongside Lepke and Gurra Shapiro in the $1 million a year extortion racket that shook the garment industry. Most figured he was dead, but the timing of his reappearance couldn't have been more precise. He was arraigned in general sessions, pleaded not guilty, posted a modest $2,000 bail, and waited. Assistant District Attorney Alexander Dryband practically shrugged it off. He was a minor figure, Dryband said, just a collector. Gambino didn't see a collector. He saw potential. And the clincher came on January 4th, 1945. Just weeks after surfacing, Riccobono was back in court, where he entered a guilty plea to conspiracy in the garment industry racket. Everyone braced for a hammer. This was, after all, a case connected to Lepke's chair ride at Sing Sing. But the hammer never came. Instead, the court handed Riccobono a suspended sentence and placed him on 3 years probation. Why? Because a friend promised to give him a job. $50 a week. That was all it took. The last man standing from one of the most notorious Jewish Italian gangs in New York was now a free man, walking out the front door like it was any other Wednesday. That wasn't luck. That was leverage. And Gambino knew exactly what to do with it. In Riccobono, he found someone who knew when to vanish and when to reappear. Someone who understood the gears behind the garment district, the language of labor racketeering, and the rhythms of violence when used strategically. He wasn't a frontline general. He was something better measured, composed, discreet, a consigliere in waiting. Luciano had Lansky and Costello. Gambino would have Riccobono. That was how empires endured. Not by fire, not by fear, but by building on top of the ruins left by men who didn't know when to disappear.